and so you'll be able to watch on there as well. This also means that if any of your friends or colleagues haven't quite managed to sign up to the conference yet, they will be able to see what's going on. We do still have a few places left, not many, but a few places that are left. There we go, it's gone live. So we've got a few places that are left if you want to dial into Zoom and engage us that way. So if you would like to get more people involved, please get them to email us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com, and we'll be able to send you through all of the dial-in instructions. So great, you're still logging on as a whole, which is absolutely brilliant. Just some housekeeping before we get cracking properly. As I mentioned at the beginning of today, those of you who are attendees, when you log in, you won't be able to speak and we won't be able to see you. My apologies. But what you will see down at the bottom of your screen is a little raise hand button, okay? And if you press on that, a little blue hand will appear over to the right-hand side of your name on the panelists list. So if anybody wants to play with that now, go for it. You can raise your hands, and Rose and I promise not to lower them until we come and find out what's going on with you. So you can raise your hands to get our attention. You will also see that you have access to the chat function. So if you click on chat just down at the bottom of your screen, that will allow you into the chat area. And what you'll be able to do there is to talk with us and discuss various different ideas or questions. You can do that on chat. Now, I'm acutely aware that some people say that this is a good idea. Some people say that this is a bad idea, leaving the chat function open. If anybody chooses to be naughty with regards to chat, we will stop that, okay? So please make sure that your chat is clean and topical with regards to what we are discussing as a whole. So thank you very much. Also, you will see that you have a Q&A button. So if you click on that, what you'll be able to do is to write questions, okay? So it's quite clear how you write questions. So you just open up that little white box and you can type your questions into the bottom of it. They will appear for all to see, and you'll also be able to see us answering your questions. Now, something that Rose will do in a little while is she will instigate the ability to click or basically give a thumbs up for a question. So if you see somebody else has asked a question that you really like or you really want to hear the answer to, please just click on that little thumbs up. So you will see, for example, that some people have been chatting away on the Q&A. So thank you very much, Ruth, for all of that. That's brilliant. So for example, if I really like the top question that Ruth has asked, I can click on her little thumbs up button and you can see that it's gone amber and there's a little 1 beside it. Okay, so that will push that question to the top of the list. So please feel free to use the up chat with regards to all of this. Rose, is there anything else we need to tell people with regards to functionality from an attendee's perspective?
No, I think we're all good. If you have any burning questions that we don't seem to be picking up on, the email address is open as well, as is Twitter, are the YouTube comments. But the same applies, naughty comments aren't allowed on those either.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Okay, so that's if you're an attendee. Speakers, we've been through all of the bits and pieces that you need to know already. Obviously, we will ask you to stay on mute unless you are actually speaking. If you have burning questions that you would like to ask to the other speakers, then please do feel free to wave at us and we will invite you to pose those questions to one another as well. So this should be a discussion forum, not just a one-way talking session. Okay, so we're trying to utilize all of the functionality of being online, which is great. So with regards to other tools and techniques that you can use whilst we're going through this conference, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to share my screen now so that you'll be able to see the website. So I'm sure all of you have access to this. You've all been on it to log in or get your sign up details to the website as a whole, sorry, to the conference as a whole. If you haven't been to the responsiblerawmaterials.com page, then please feel free to go and take a look at it as soon as possible. Also, key with regards to this page, if you click on schedule, what you will see here is the ability to download the schedule with the talk titles. Okay, so if I click on that, what you will see opens up is the schedule, and you'll see the titles of all of the talks. So you can see what is going on over the next few days by clicking on here. Also, as well, what you can do is go to the abstracts page, and this not only has the high level schedule, but also it has all of the different abstracts for all of the different talks that our wonderful speakers have been sending in over the last week or so. Now, you don't have to trawl through this looking for your favorite speaker. Instead, what you can do is you can look at the schedule and you can say, okay, I'm most interested in Monday afternoon. And in fact, I'd like to see what Christopher Reeves is going to be talking about. So I'm going to click on his abstract over here. Christopher's trying not to smile. Okay, and what we've got here is you've got Christopher's abstract together with a bit of a biography with regards to who Christopher is. What we will be doing after Christopher finishes his talk is we're going to format his video, and then we're going to embed his video into this abstract page as well. So this gets a one-stop shop for all of the information that we're pulling together as a result of this conference. So this abstract page will turn into one of the outputs from the conference, because it will include not only the abstracts, but also the videos, provided the speakers are happy with us or happy for us to share the videos. All of this will be shared in here. So you can either search by going to a day or a time of the week, and if you click on more, you will see that more options cascade down here. You can also click on something like producers, for example, and this is where we have sliced and diced some of the agenda. So it's really pulling out people who are speaking to slightly different themes, so you'll be able to see them all listed here as a whole. So I'm just going to go back to Monday afternoon, because of course that is the session that we are in now, and you can see that 56 people have gone and looked at Christopher's abstract. So Christopher, I don't think that's you clicking on your own abstract 56 times. No, I can see him laughing. I think that's people actually going in and seeing what it is you have to say, which is absolutely fantastic. The final thing to mention with regards to the website as a whole, or actually there are a number of other things, but in terms of watching the live conference, obviously all of you have managed to log into either Zoom or into YouTube, so congratulations. As I mentioned, all of the information will go up on the abstract page as soon as we manage to render those videos. So they'll go up as soon as possible. Final things to mention, yes, we said that this conference is 100% free, as you guys have all noticed, but what we're doing is we are donating money to some very relevant charities, either with regards to COVID-19, so you'll see the NHS, so that's very pertinent for those of us here in the UK, through to a number of other charities being mentioned here as well. So all of your money will go through an online giving page to be able to give some cash to those charities should you so desire that to happen. Otherwise, this conference is 100% free. With regards to sponsors for this conference, what you've got here are the likes of the London Metal Exchange, who've been very kind in donating some funds with regards to today. We also have the Mineral Deposit Studies Group, who have also donated some funds to allow today to happen, along with Satala, who are hosting this conference, and a whole range of other organizations as well, all of whom you will see speaking during the course of the next week. If any of our speakers would like their logos to appear on here, that is 100% okay. Please just email them through to us and we will put them up on the website. Finally, we have some learning materials that we are putting together in parallel with the conference. So not only are we recording all of the sessions, we're also writing summary blogs for each session that will be posted online as fast as we can do it. We're also going to put together some university style questions. So these are some essay questions which you could use for students, be they at high school, be they at university, and that can make use of some of the talks that we're going to be listening to over the course of the next week. So we're going to put together some learning materials that you have here. We also have a link to some of the teaching resources from the Geological Society, as well as some other key aspects or key links that we find very useful when talking about responsible raw materials. If you think that there are additional links that we should be putting on here, again, please feel free to send them through to us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com, and we will put them up online as fast as possible, because again, this is supposed to be a repository to which you can all come to share your ideas and to share your passion for making sure that the raw materials that we use in our everyday lives and in all of the technology that we need is extracted, is processed, is bought, and is paid for in the most responsible way possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because you can all work out how all of that happens. And just go back to our main page again, because what we're going to have over the course of this afternoon are some phenomenal speakers that have very, very kindly donated their time for free to share their perspectives with regards to responsible raw materials with us. Now, unlike perhaps your normal face-to-face conferences where you'd have themed sessions, so you'd have people talking about finding the raw materials in the ground, all speaking together and giving you an array of different perspectives around that exploration side. Rather than doing that in set themes, what we've done is muddle everybody up, because we think it would be really nice to hear from a different array of people every day, rather than all of your geologists together. Speaking as a geologist, I really enjoy hearing from other geologists, but it's perhaps good for me to hear from some of the investors or some of the regulators or some of the other people that might be involved in our full value chain for raw materials as a whole. So the people that we've got lined up for you this afternoon, you will hear some great insight from all of them. So Christopher Reeves is going to start off this afternoon, and I can see Christopher looking nice and smiley, if not a bit tense with regards to his session. Christopher's going to kick us off by giving us an overview with regards to reimagining elements that may be able to help change the world. So no pun intended there, Christopher. We're really looking forward to your talk. So we get that nice overview with regards to why is this so important? Why is it so important that we are able to understand where we find rocks like this? So this is a rock. See, I'm a geologist, John. I can see you smiling at me. Okay, I'm a geologist. I'm never very far from a rock. So this rock here contains lots of copper and lots of cobalt. It comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a very, very topical part of the world at the moment with regards to responsible raw materials. So how do we take a rock like this? How do we find it? How do we extract it out of the ground? How do we break it down into all of those component parts that we really need? How do we ship it to those very clever people who then eventually turn it into something like this? So something like a mobile phone or a lithium battery or something like that that we need in our day-to-day lives. That is what we're talking about today. And Christopher is going to touch on some of those different aspects from along that value chain. We're then going to hear from Ludovine Wouters, who is a phenomenal lawyer. We're not going to hold that against you, Ludovine, who has spent a lot of her time in Côte d'Ivoire. So Ludovine is the go-to expert when it comes to all things governance and all things Africa as well. So we're going to get a really interesting insight from Ludovine with regards to, okay, so what does this look like from a governance perspective? And Ludovine, I should mention, is based in France, whilst Christopher is based in London, UK. We're then going to hop across the Atlantic Ocean as well as an entire continent, and we're going to go to Vancouver. We're going to go to John Thompson, who is one of the go-to people with regards to economic geology. John's worked not only in private sector, but also in the academic side of things as well. And so John is going to give us that insight from his perspective with regards to finding those rocks and then be able to report on them in a really nice, responsible manner. We're then going to come back to Europe. And the wonderful Andy Chur, who's originally from South Africa, but now living in the south of France, is going to talk to us about sharing the benefits. So this is a case here of looking at the social aspects, etc., with regards to our raw materials, as well as the economic aspects as well. So Andy's going to really be able to give us the insight from a different angle with regards to our responsible raw materials. We're then going to go back to Vancouver again, and we're going to go to Susan Joyce, who is the Queen of Human Rights. I don't know if she'll like me introducing her in that way, but Susan is absolutely phenomenal and one of the go-to people in this world. If you're trying to understand what could the human implications of mining actually be with regards to local communities in a variety of different parts of the world, especially Latin America. We're then going to come to Pierre, who's going to talk about embedding environment, social and governance and the Sustainable Development Goals, some of which you will see up on the wall behind me in corporate culture, not just in reporting. So Pierre is expert when it comes to reporting all of this good stuff. He's an expert with regards to all of those sustainability metrics. But how do we make them real rather than just a tick box exercise? Then we're going to come to Hugo Brody. So we're going to come back to the UK and the London Metal Exchange. And Hugo's going to give us an insight as to what does the London Metal Exchange see as being responsible sourcing for all of these materials and metals, which I think all of us agree will be a really, really interesting talk. And then finally, we're going to finish off today with Andrew Thake, who is the man behind a myriad of different conferences that we have around the world. Andrew is the man behind conferences such as Minds and Money, along with lots of other conferences. He tells me that this is the first time he has actually been invited to speak at a conference. So we're feeling quite proud of ourselves because we'll be able to get under the skin of what he gets to see in terms of how these conferences have evolved through time. And does anybody actually care about responsibility or environment, social governance, etc. And if so, how has that changed over the last few years? And how does he predict it may change in the future, especially seeing as we are, of course, in the middle of a fairly unique circumstance, which is, of course, COVID-19. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I can see that lots of you are here online in Zoom, which is great. And some more of you are watching over YouTube. So not to make any of our speakers at all nervous, I'm gently going to segue across to the wonderful Christopher Reeves. Christopher, you've got about 30 seconds before we're going to hand over to you properly. And ladies and gentlemen, I seriously suggest that you do go and take a look at Christopher's abstract because it will give you additional background information. Christopher was also absolutely key to organising a conference that we ran. It was a face-to-face conference that we ran in London back in October last year with the Geological Society of London, looking at what is responsible investing. So many of the ideas that you'll hear here today, he shared with us back 6 months or so ago, but I'm sure that they have developed further over the last little while. And Christopher, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself. Meanwhile, I'm going to spotlight you so that everybody will be able to see you. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your virtual hands together for the wonderful Christopher Reeves. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to start what is surely a fascinating series of talks on responsible raw materials, covering insights from people that very literally are deep into the rocks and weeds of the industry, through to the views of changes in expectations from markets, investors and society. At the outset, I would like to say that I feel our current shared experience of the pandemic will only increase our focus on the role of natural capital. Paraphrasing the title of John Brown's book, The 7 Elements That Changed the World, the global discussion on how we build back better with resilience does need to include the foundation, dare I say bedrock, of that system, namely through reframing the role of raw materials. So will leaders and business go back to doing things they were before the pandemic? Clearly not. There are equally wider systemic issues at play beyond the current crisis. And taking a quote from a recent discussion, unlike COVID-19, we won't be able to find a vaccine for climate change. As an optimist for the future, seeing the human capacity for ingenuity means that I see growth and transformation from this crisis. Rather than just relying on a trust but verify type model, the global nature of this crisis and our industry means that we need to ensure trust also comes through relationships and collaboration. If current miners cannot meet demands, the market will find a way through new business models. The sources and uses of our raw materials are key to the demands of a circular economy. where primary resource remains important, although often misunderstood, with low carbon products coming to market and consumer product companies like Apple making bold statements on the use of raw materials and recycled materials. The careful management of available resources is both a business and a consumer issue. This is not about stopping extractive activity, as along with the economic benefits of natural capital, there remains a need for transparent, pure inputs, where uncontaminated material streams increase the collection and redistribution efficiency whilst maintaining quality, particularly of technical materials, which in turn extends product longevity and increased material productivity. In a statement on 6th of May this year, the International Energy Agency talked about clean energy after the COVID-19 crisis and said that a renewed focus on material supplies and mineral supplies is vital for the accelerated energy transition. The mining industry went into the current crisis in a financially good position, having worked through a lot of structural inefficiency and poor capital management issues in the 2013-15 crash. Much of the response to that crisis was focused on operations and financial structures. Where the global pandemic has focused the attention is on social issues. A greater appreciation of what a responsible raw material industry means will help with not just unlocking the impact of delivering those raw materials in a sustainable economy, but also recognizing the value of frontline workers in any value chain, be they healthcare workers in Germany or miners in Guinea. The UN Sustainable Development Goals definition of impact really has gained an edge. The natural resources sector is a fascinating nexus where politics, business, society and development meet, all at a pinch point where the resources exist in the ground in one location and cannot be moved, meaning you have to deal with people and environments around them. The world will continue to need raw materials, and the drive to clean energy and an increasingly urbanized society have not changed, much as many of us are reflecting under the lockdown on the joys of living in the countryside. With governments putting vast sums of money into supporting the global economy and stimulating various parts of industry, one thing also feels clear to me is that the value of a country's raw materials and natural resources will be getting greater attention. Consumers and investors are increasingly appreciating the intrinsic value of natural capital and the ecosystem services tied to those raw materials. And this is driving changes in expectations, reporting, and governance. Where the brand of the mining sector can really change is to be perceived less like the evil villains of the 2009 Avatar film, to be more the creators and engineers and entrepreneurs, or the place where value is associated with the product. Consumer and healthcare sectors have been through multiple cycles of discussion with this, with the push-pull of consumer and regulation challenging brands, all of which has led to a growth in the market, improvements in standards and efficiency, and an increase in brand value. As evidence of this move from expectation into requirements, this year at the Davos World Economic Forum, the International Business Council and the Big Four accounting firms began a process to define common metrics for consistent reporting of ESG measures, which is due to issue drafts later this year. So how will the role of raw materials be reflected in this? Business and investors are wrestling with an avalanche of data requests for increased transparency from a range of stakeholders. And whilst wanting to be open and transparent, many have felt a lot like the current ESG investor drive has added too much process and is more of a box-ticking exercise than a help to management team who are finding and producing responsible tons and ounces. So where are the opportunities for business, and what role can a responsible business, investor, or consumer play? The simple answer is, it depends. Taking the mid and long-term view, companies should be ready for a more discussion on their approach to valuing their natural capital, including with their reserves and resources. This valuation is extending from how they manage their mines from exploration to closure, the way they negotiate licenses, royalties, transfer pricing agreements, and the impact of any sustainability programs, particularly looking at local supply chains and community engagement. The news of the setup of the first cobalt and Glencore refinery in Canada illustrates how supply chains are intrinsically linked to global trade and politics, and that access to raw materials is again changing the way we do business. The operational aspects of efficiency, waste reduction, recycling, life cycle assessment, maintenance, or chemicals management are all relatively well understood by the industry, if not always best accomplished or described. The social dimension of the current crisis has meant that care for employees will get more attention. The extractive sector has long had health and safety as a key driver, with safety moments starting most meetings. What has been interesting is to see these moving from the more operational into health and wellness and the understanding of home and community issues, meaning livelihood programs will equally get an additional focus. A social license to operate is never more important, and the mining sector has many negative cases of where this has gone wrong. Being a responsible business rather than just efficient and productive does help manage risks, financial discounts, and managing the expectations of communities seeking a share in any wealth generated near their home. For business and investors, this is also an issue that should not be framed as a cost. It is a clear investment priority. Not least that investors have shown how better management of social issues in any portfolio investment is one of the most significant ways to reduce systemic risk in a portfolio. Furthermore, with 2020 described by the UN as a year for nature and biodiversity, the UN chief Antonio Guterres has spoken at length on safeguarding issues for nature. And where in 2015 it began a cycle of increased focus on carbon and climate, markets are now looking at how they can manage their real-world impacts. And following the widespread development and use of the framework from the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, on the issues of climate and carbon, the financial markets are looking to where other externalities carry financial impact. One example being in January this year, there was a statement from a consortia of investors, AXA, Paribas, Minova, and Sycamore, setting up a biodiversity database for asset managers. As business delves into these other aspects of ESG, be that water, biodiversity, or communities and culture around projects and associated infrastructure, what will become clear is how these other impacts are highly localized and project specific, requiring greater engagement between all parties to understand what impact is desired and how risks can be better managed. For the mining sector, the role of stewardship for land not being used for mining presents an opportunity to better describe how they can be part of the solution. The long-term nature of the sector means we need to help communicate the value across the full cycle, from exploration, development, and operations through to closure and mitigation. Framing of risk and sustainability has a lot to answer for, particularly where the time horizons of any value delivery vary so much according to stakeholders. From discussion on traceable supply chains, there is now greater talk of track and trace of human beings, all of which challenges the culture and capabilities for many. And it does present an opportunity for the sector responsible for that first mile of raw materials. The industry does have access to the data that matters. The capabilities of leaders are being put to the test, while new technologies offer great potential as tools to enable a greater understanding of where and how our raw materials really do change the world. So thank you for listening, and I hope to look forward to unpicking how we can all collaborate to make this a more resilient industry that delivers value to shareholders and stakeholders. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christopher. And I'm afraid you're going to have to imagine in your mind this round of applause that is coming your way now. Thank you also for sticking to your 10 minutes so exactly. Now, whilst everybody is thinking of those questions and typing them into the Q&A, I know that you touched on this during your talk, Christopher, but Ed Sides has put forward a very, very good question, which is, what exactly is meant by natural capital? i.e., do you mean the natural resources available for exploitation, or perhaps do you mean something broader than that?
It is broader than that. There is actually a natural capital protocol that has been defined, which gives you much more detailed views of how it is the resources, but it is also the rest of the ecosystem around it. So it is sort of all the biodiversity as well as actually the raw materials that are in the ground. And that is something that is coming through in sustainability understanding. And I should apologize, I should have said natural capital is much more of a defined thing on a broader thing than just metals and minerals.
Great, so I hope that answers your questions, Ed. So it's not just the actual rock that's in the ground, it's that broader external context as well with regards to this particular situation. So Christopher, a question from myself. So of course, none of us necessarily expected COVID-19 to happen at all. Obviously, it is causing a lot of distress and upset to the world as a whole. But if we take a step away from the emotional aspects of COVID-19, do you think that on balance, it's actually providing a big opportunity for the extractive sector to take stock of the responsibility aspects of raw materials, or do you think it is hampering what was already steaming along within the sector as a whole?
I don't think it's derailed any responsible investment activity. It has given everybody the short-term hit of a real tragedy and crisis, which has got many businesses looking at liquidity. There are people who are looking with fundamentally quite good businesses at will they survive, as well as the deal of how to look after responsibly your employees right the way through to frontline workers. And that has been a distraction. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. It just means business day to day can't continue whilst you're having to go and sort of do a little bit of firefighting on that. Will it continue on responsible investment? I think that there's been enough discussion around globalization to show that all of these global supply chains mean that we're in this together. I'm, as I said, an optimist that if we can actually sort of work out how you process minerals that are mined in Africa, processed in China, used in North America, but consumed in Europe, recycled in Ghana, you've got to try and sort of work through all of this as a sort of a collaborative force. There are two different responses you can have to this. You've got countries and people who can go for this as a blow everybody else, we'll survive ourselves, we'll look after ourselves. Or we have the much more collaborative response of, look, let's just share vaccine knowledge, let's just share best practice, share some ideas about what can work. Because unlike some of the previous financial crises, there's not a structural issue around many of the industries. It has highlighted some of the zombie companies that are being kept alive. But fundamentally, there's an enforced supply and an enforced demand restriction on the industry. But behind it all, as I said, there's some systemic issues which are continuing. And I think that it has just given the mining industry an opportunity to have some time to think before continuing.
So with regards to those systemic issues, Christopher, what do you think, where do you think we might want to start? So as we're seeing the sectors get back up and running again, and we're seeing those supply chains get back up and running, what do you think are some of those systemic issues that we might be able to tackle right now or in the near future?
Going into the crisis, whilst I said the sector is quite robust financially, it is considered potentially undervalued in terms of sort of, do people appreciate what goes into getting those tons and ounces out of the ground? To get that valuation correct, the industry needs to tell a better story. It's not a very good sector for doing that. Adapting new business models, adapting new processes, adapting new technologies. They would say it's good, but I think that they are still quite slow. What could we do better? No, I think that there's plenty for the sector to sort of live up to in the future. There's going to be some M&A in some sectors like gold, which is quite popular at the moment, store of wealth, and many of the other sectors are quite neutral. But I think that, sorry, a train of thought just momentarily went there. But I think that from a sort of ESG perspective, the challenge of real world impacts from investors, they're facing the challenge of greenwash, where they're investing in projects where they're not quite sure what the actual impact is. They're saying they're being responsible, but what does that actually mean when you get into it? So carbon and climate, to my mind, is a lovely global issue that we all need to address, but it is quite a sort of a macro issue. But when you get into the projects, the social issues and the sort of the small externalities down at the project level are, and I've had this conversation with a number of asset managers, investment officers, chief investment officers, it's such a fast-paced move around ESG, and they are often good financial asset managers, great financial investors, but they don't have capital project experience, and why should they? So how do you build that in to get that proper diligence around, are you being a responsible investor?
Great, thanks, Christopher. So the questions are now coming in thick and fast, you'll be glad to know. I'm going to just start with one that builds on what you were saying about the green credentials, perhaps of the investing side. So this comes from Sandra. So, and warning, it's quite a long question. For mining the mining sector to be a resilient industry, shouldn't efforts be implemented towards consumer behavior? I make this question because everyone says that we must make the green transition, but by reducing the consumption won't make a bigger effect. And shouldn't mining do something in that direction linked in with geoethics? So I think this is a question around, okay, what can consumers be doing, if anything, with regards to the nature with which our raw materials are extracted, processed, bought and sold? So what can consumers be doing, Christopher?
There's loads of things. Employees of mining companies are also consumers. You have people in the more consumer-facing parts of the mining industry have been really addressing this for a while. Diamonds. And they've sort of been looking at the brand value of what makes a responsible diamond, and a whole load of supply chain issues there. How does a consumer change behavior? Yeah, put pressure. Be a bit more active and vocal. Realize you've got to pay a bit more sometimes. The food industry has been through this. Where does your food come from? What makes good food? Do you like having food that, I mean, I think the example of someone using a cheap high street brand t-shirt, and they're quite happily going out there and thinking, okay, you're saying you want it to be ethic, but do you really think it costs you £1 to go and have a t-shirt made out of natural cotton and flown around the world? So I think that the idea of stakeholder capitalism is showing where a lot of activism is coming through. This is coming through in pressure, and you've seen that from the investors as well as from shareholders, as well as from NGOs and very powerful activist and extremist groups who are picking up on this. But consumers can be more positive. They can be shareholders in these industries. They can take a part in it. They can share the benefits and play a role in the shareholder meetings. You can also go as a consumer to the person who is selling you the product and say, where does this come from? Ask the question. Get them to feel difficult about it. So I think it's just being curious, ask questions, get involved.
Brilliant. So with that, Christopher, thank you very, very much. I think that be curious, ask questions, get involved is a really key takeaway that you finished on there from your talk. Thank you very, very much. And another virtual round of applause from all of us sitting wherever we are around the world. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Now, I know that there are some other fantastic questions that are coming through on the Q&A, and don't worry, we will ask them to our different speakers as we go through this afternoon. And Christopher is not going anywhere. And in fact, now what we're going to do, Christopher's there going, well, maybe. Now what we're going to do is we're going to hop across the channel to Ludovine, who is sitting in glorious France. So Ludovine, if you want to get ready to take yourself off mute, and we'll get ready to spotlight you as our main go-to person. I can see that Ludovine is just sharing her slides now, which is brilliant. Now, with regards to all of this, this is a case where Ludovine, as I mentioned, is a lawyer. We won't hold that against you, Ludovine, because you're a very lovely lawyer, and also makes the role of governance in environment, social governance transformation incredibly accessible to understand. So, Ludovine, over to your wonderful self. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks to Sutarla and particularly Sarah and Rose for organizing this great initiative. Just to complete what you were saying in terms of what I do, I mostly work with mining companies and investors in Africa on corporate and regulatory issues, and also with governments or international organizations on mining policy and taxation issues. So I think I'm a good lawyer, and you know, I deserve to be here. Thanks for letting me chat today, and I'm so happy to come right after Christopher, because in some ways we're sort of raising similar questions and offering bits of answers, I hope. So What I wanted to do today with all of you is to demystify the concept of governance, because it's the third pillar of ESG, but it's also, in my view, the pillar that enables the others. And so I'm hoping that by removing some of the lawyerly overtones, maybe we can make it something more useful for all of us to leverage in our own work towards achieving better integration of ESG across the mining sector. And actually, as I was preparing for this, I was reminded last week that the ESG transformation, which I think a lot, if not all of us on this session today and probably throughout the week agree, it's not a straight line and it's not a done deal. Last week, I sat on an excellent webinar with some highly respected mining investors, and they were asked, okay, so how much does ESG factor in your investment decisions? And actually, do you think it'll stay top of the agenda for mining CEOs after COVID-19? And there was a bit of back and forth, but generally they agreed that, well, E is unavoidable because it's mandatory. G is taken care of because we're listed, and S, well, there's been good progress. And it really struck me that this view, this perspective of the mining industry very clearly would not be shared by most people outside the mining industry. We seem to often forget the level of negative perception that's out there about the industry. And I personally think resource nationalism is only one of the manifestations of how we are viewed collectively in terms of our negative impact and not enough positive outcome. I was also struck by the very reductive view of ESG that these investors took, because at best, one of them cited it expressly as being a risk mitigation tool, which is important, but it's level 1. And another investor actually referred to it as a more or less pointless box-ticking exercise, which kind of broke my heart, but also reminded me that we, the believers, still have a lot of convincing to do, not just vis-a-vis stakeholders and in terms of turning around the perception, but vis-a-vis our own industry in terms of the value of what the ESG proposition actually brings. And really, that's why I wanted to start by discussing what's at stake here. This overly, extremely simplistic diagram here is really just a miniature snapshot of the #1 characteristic for me of the mining sector, which is the complexity and diversity of stakeholders in global value chains that basically circle the world once or twice. Christopher was alluding to it. And it's also characterized by actors who are not only disconnected in terms of their geographic location, but also their divergence of purpose. And when you look at that, one thing is clear is that there's no opportunity for complete alignment. What can be achieved is balance. And balance across these multi-stakeholder relationships, for me, comes when, firstly, it's agreed that none of these relationships is going to happen solely to the detriment of one or several others. And that's a decision. It's not something that just happens. The other thing that allows balance is if the essential moments of overlap or the areas of overlap are anticipated and managed in a way where all the parties are seeking confluence instead of conflict. And when I say the areas of overlap, I mean those key moments where parties interact with significant impact on the others. Permitting is one of them. Commercialization, because it's directly linked to taxation. These are moments when all of a sudden the chain has to come together, because if it breaks down there, then none of it works. And that management of those relationships, that is what governance is. There's 2 aspects to governance which you'll hear discussed. The first one is corporate governance. Summarized grossly, it's the relationships within and from the mining companies and exploration companies. And the other part is minerals governance or natural resources governance, which is really focused on the potential for mining as an industry to serve as a catalyst for growth and development. And effectively, it's focused on policy and how the government regulates the companies as well as the other stakeholders. So I wanted to focus here on corporate governance because natural resources governance is a whole universe unto itself. And like a good lawyer, I want to start with a definition. The reason I've proposed that we focus on this one is because I think there's about 20,000 frameworks and each have their own definition. I quite like this one because firstly, it's very modern in that it is, unlike the first corporate governance definitions, which arose in the early 1990s, basically in reaction to corporate scandals. This is not focused on shareholders. It takes in a much wider set of stakeholders. And for me, the entire purpose of this definition and the document that it opens is to basically implement a system of checks and balances. And I find that's an excellent way of creating equilibrium between parties. The second reason I wanted to propose this is because the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance were first adopted in 1999. They were updated in 2015, and they're signed up to and endorsed by both of these key institutions. So effectively, in my view, they are the benchmark for national policy as well as private sector initiatives in corporate governance. And the third one is because this definition, for me, touches on the two key points that make corporate governance useful and not a pointless box-ticking exercise. Because it highlights that it's about objectives, principles. Again, it's a decision, and it's implemented via relationships. So if we think about corporate governance, one of the key mistakes we need to avoid is confusing it with compliance. Compliance is about adhering to a set of structures, policies, rules, procedures. These are extremely important. Let's not get that wrong. However, governance is when you factor in people, because structures and policies and procedures do not generate culture. They do not generate a system where people accept, internalize, and operationalize the principles underlying them. However, if there is buy-in, if there's a real organizational purpose that people can adhere to, and that is internal and external, that's when you turn compliance into something that drives a culture. And that culture is, in my view, one of the essential parts of organizational success. If we define organizational success as something that by definition takes into account multiple stakeholders, that's how we achieve governance. So I highlighted these 4 principles on the side because they're common across all corporate governance frameworks. And they are, for me, the way you bring people into this, because it's all down to people. Accountability and empowerment, I think we all understand, and they're 2 sides of the same coin. It's extremely important that people understand and are given the means to accept the responsibilities, but also that they're held to account on whether and how they've actually exercised that authority. Transparency, I want to be clear, transparency is not nice to have for its own sake. Transparency is the way we level the playing field between stakeholders who know and those who don't. And if we want meaningful engagement, we need a common base of information and knowledge. Transparency is about making engagement meaningful. Putting out shed loads of data, if it's not accurately presented in a way that it allows meaningful engagement, is a useless exercise. And that's when we fall back into the box ticking. And fairness for me is an important one because, again, structures, policies, procedures, rules, they come to their limit when you can adhere to the letter, but if you don't understand the spirit, you will fail. And that's where fairness comes in, because if we understand fairness as a guiding principle in an organization's decisions and actions and relationships, then that's where we effectively can strike the balance between multiple stakeholder interests. And just to be clear, I think also, if all we're doing is looking for risk mitigation, fairness is where reputational risk lies. We all know of companies that have adhered to the law and absolutely, can demonstrate that they have done what they can do, but they've not been fair. And public opinion will turn on them exactly for that. So I don't think it's very useful here to go into the details of best practices and what they are and what they entail. Generally, there's 5 areas of best practices. The first one is the board, because corporate governance hinges on the board as one of the primary points of contact between stakeholders and the inside of the company. Transparent disclosure, as I discussed, there's a lot of the corporate governance work that focuses on making information available. Risk management is a pillar of corporate governance. Good corporate citizenship is about adopting and implementing policies, but also making sure that they reflect values throughout the organization. And then, of course, what brings it all together is stakeholder engagement. So there are multiple frameworks, multiple guidelines as to how to achieve all of this. I think where I wanted us to end up today is to understand that effectively corporate governance is a tool to achieve better performance. It's not just performance on a financial or an operational level. It's also environmental, it's also social. Corporate governance is effectively where a company decides what it wants to do and how it's going to get it done. And that is the purpose of building these structures, because they effectively develop the resilience of a company, but also they are the way to achieve its own purpose. And so that's why I cited Robert Eccles, because he really is one of the great thinkers of ESG. And what he says is very clear. If you have appropriate corporate governance in place, then by definition, environmental and social will be managed properly, because the board is meant to represent the interests of an entire set of stakeholders. Once those are understood, that's the way to start dealing with them. So that's what I wanted to discuss with you today. And I'm available for your questions. Thank you. You see, it wasn't that bad. It's legal, but it's still good.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Ludivine. That was absolutely fantastic. And we do have a number of questions for you if you're able to stay on the line just for another 5 minutes or so. The first one of being that, so decision makers within a company, corporate governance, different roles and responsibilities, is this something where you usually have a corporate governance department or team, or is it something where it's spread out amongst all the different people within the organization? How is that usually done?
There's as many structures and frameworks as there are companies. What I think is really important is thinking of the role of shareholders, because shareholders are the ultimate arbitrator of a company's purpose, of how it's run and whether it's performing. If they like the performance, then they support a board. That board empowers executives, and all together they strive towards a goal. So I think it's important to have specialist functions who manage aspects of corporate governance, whether that's disclosure, compliance is essential, risk management. I'm not going to say that to you, but come on, it's key. But ultimately, all of this has to flow back to one central point, and that's the board. And if we understand that the board is really the place where the vision of shareholders meets the execution and the communication from executives, then you see that's where effectively we've ticked the first 3 steps towards achieving outcomes.
Thanks, Ludivine. Building on that, so all of this sounds absolutely beautiful and fantastic and fairly simple and straightforward if you're a big company with lots of resources. But what happens if you're a smaller organization? So perhaps you don't have the resources to make sure that all of this governance is happening. What's your view with regards to that? Do you think that it's just as applicable everywhere, especially when you're integrating ESG, or are there different ways of doing it?
I think to some extent we are all already doing it. So there's a mystique to, oh, ESG is for big companies who've got lots of people and lots of financial resources or technical capacity. That's not the case. Even the smallest company has an owner, a board, and an executive. And those three, they have a vision. Defining what it is that company wants to be, it can come down to a single exploration project. You're still going to do it correctly. Of course, 99% of the risks, 99% of the social engagement opportunities don't concern you. But again, the board and management always have the capacity to think, what's actually material to the way I run this company? What's material to my investors? What is it they're going to accept and what is it they're not going to accept? And how can I make negative impacts less? How can I achieve potential and realize opportunities? And if they decide, well, I'm not going to consider any other stakeholder than my investors, that's great. The reality is we know at some point they need to shift over to people who probably will. So how much risk are they willing to take in terms of how that value is going to be realized at some point? It is clear that, increasingly companies, even the smallest, will be penalized for not thinking about this. We're not talking about implementing great big frameworks which are reported on in huge reports. This can be done small so long as it's done with conviction and a real willingness to achieve outcomes.
Fantastic. One final very quick question for you, Ludovine, because they are coming in thick and fast right now. And this question looks at, so you mentioned that corporate governance and minerals governance or materials governance overlap more and tend to merge into a single set of principles. Can you just very quickly elaborate on that so people understand what you meant?
Well, initially corporate governance focused only on one thing, which is, and I'll summarize quickly, executives cannot go off the reservation and not adhere to the rights and interests of shareholders. That's shifted towards a multi-stakeholder approach. Similarly, you have mining policy, which is now assisted by a significant number of initiatives. I've put some of these key references on my last slide, some of which go down to company level. And they embed in their view of how the resource companies need to participate in growth, they embed a series of rules which actually affect how a company operates. So the overlap is increasing. More importantly, the very principles are now common. And if you particularly pay attention to a report that came out from the International Resource Panel in 2019, along with the work, for example, of the Responsible Mining Foundation, they very much look to integrate all of that into a cohesive set of principles. And that, for me, is the way forward. It's not about choosing the framework. It's about identifying what it is you want to achieve and then making sure that it fits within those global principles that are applied more or less across all of these frameworks.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Ludovine.
Thank you.
And you can now imagine that immense round of applause. So thank you very, very, very much. It's brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go from the wonderful Ludovine in France all the way across to the phenomenal John in Vancouver. So John, if you have any slides that you'd like to share, now is your moment of sharing. And what I will do is I will spotlight you as well so that we can focus in on you. So ladies and gentlemen, John is our first true geologist that we have on the call here today. Obviously I am biased because yes, I am also a geologist. But John, without further ado, across to yourself. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah and Rose, for including me in this and doing such an amazing job of putting this conference together. I don't know that I think of myself as a true geologist, but a geologist I still am at heart, although I do many, many other things, which is, and it would take way too long to explain what I do. So I'm going to talk today about minerals and the mineral resource sector as a system. And Christopher and Ludovine have already provided significant framework around parts of this system and have very well illustrated the complexity that's inherent in it. And when you think of systems in general, complexity is a very important part of that story. So metal demand. So in the crisis that we're facing right now in COVID-19, there's obviously been massive disruption and tragedies for many, many people. But one of the other factors of COVID-19 is, of course, that metal prices and metal demand has been hit very significantly. And in fact, many people working in individual commodities feel that we may take anywhere from 2 to 4 years to recover, depending on which scenario you like to play out. But recover we will at some point, and demand will return because of basic human needs for infrastructure and commodities, the technology that continues to be developed, and of course, because of the drive towards a more sustainable future, particularly the use of green energy or clean energy. So on this picture here, this slide, I show in the center here some clean energy, some solar and some wind, and they will continue to develop. And in fact, it'd be interesting perhaps for many of your listeners to note that the US in the month of April, the production from clean energy exceeded coal in terms of total power generation for the whole of the month of April. And that, of course, is in part related to COVID-19 as well. On the right-hand side of the slide here is some transportation. And what's interesting about this transportation is all three of those pieces of transportation, the plane, the car, and the ferry, are powered by lithium-ion batteries. So this is part of electrification that we're going to see, and it's going to come back and increase through COVID-19 and well beyond. And on the left, of course, is communication, which is a vital part of our lives and involves lots of commodities. Well, being a true geologist, I start with the Earth, and the Earth, as you probably all appreciate, is a very special place. In fact, if it were not for the characteristics of the Earth, we would not be here. It's essentially a unique planet in our solar system. But one of the less appreciated parts of the Earth is the fact that it's the processes that go on within it concentrate minerals and metals to such a level that we as humans have been able to recognize them, exploit them, and use those metals. And we've been doing that for 5,000, perhaps almost as much as 10,000 years. So this is not a new phenomenon. But doing this comes with many challenges. So on the sort of discovery side, the initiation of the process, which is how which we will have to return to at some point as the demand increases, we need to use a lot of techniques and technologies in order to have a better chance of making this very difficult task of finding new mineral deposits. But it's not just the discovery phase. Discovery, of course, leads to development, and the purpose of development is to produce the metals and minerals. But in the context that we're talking about today, we want to do that by minimizing the footprint that we create in that process. All of this, from the discovery through development through to actual minimizing the footprint, creating a better mine, a responsible mine, involves using all the data, interpreting it effectively, integrating it, and in the modern world, integration now involves a lot of tools and techniques, including AI, machine learning, and so on, in order to try and build a better understanding of what we're going to try and do in the future. So if we're going to do this, we're going to put this together, one of the things we need to aim to do is to create an integrated resource model, to take all this complexity, all this system complexity, and build it into an integrated resource model that captures the multi-scale data, geospatial data, and incorporates the processes that we now understand that goes on in the Earth. And in the bottom half of the slide, you can see a schematic of how this works, of energy and materials moving through the Earth and being concentrated at a site, which is where we actually end up creating a mine. So these are complex models in themselves, but now we can introduce and add to these models by incorporating economic, environmental, and cultural or social data at the same scale as the processes that you can see for the Earth that concentrated these metals and minerals, so over tens to hundreds of kilometers. And if we put that all together as an integrated model, we can then support effective project management and take it at a landscape scale context rather than thinking of it as an individual small project. So that's terrific. We can do that on the front end, but while we're doing that, we still have to improve the operations in order to achieve better outcomes, cleaner, greener outcomes, more responsible mines. So the good news is there is a lot of work going on, and this will continue and probably accelerate post-COVID. So large open pits, such as the one on your left, are going to become underground mines. In the center of the view there is automation. This is a large haul truck with no driver, and it's quite likely that the move to automation of this type will be increased, the rate of it will be increased by COVID-19. Clearly, if you haven't got a driver, you are definitely meeting social distancing criteria. And finally, the bottom one on the bottom right is the large shovel here that's loading this truck has sensors on it which detects the concentration of the metal in the material that's going in the truck. And that truck can now be sent to the mill to produce metal or concentrate of their metal, or it can go to the waste pile. So we can intensify our ability to be selective. We can increase our selectivity. And the goal here is to produce more metal from less rock rather than what we've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years, which is the reverse, producing less metal from more rock. So if we in that scenario there at the mine, that started over here on the left-hand side of the screen here, where we were looking at the actual mine, the development of the mine and the processing. But that goal of being more effective, more efficient, more responsible has to continue through this value chain from the left, the upstream side, through to the market applications, and of course, ultimately to the demand, the downstream side. And it's at the downstream side, of course, that we also need to focus on the circular economy, the reduce, reuse, recycle part of it, which involves the mining industry because some of the products generated from that recycling effort return through these areas back into the center of this diagram. This is a push-pull diagram. There's push-pull between supply and demand, but there's equal push-pull between human social constraints at the site from communities who object or potentially object to development, and the consumer pull and the consumer pressure, which can be positive or negative, that applies to this scenario. So in this simple diagram illustrates the complexity, again, the system that we need to understand if we're going to be effective in terms of our responsible resources and our raw materials. And finally, we have to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, as illustrated in the little diagram in the center here, encompasses everything from developing a mine on the far left to listening and effectively engaging and understanding the needs of the communities that we work with. And this has been touched on already and will be touched on by subsequent speakers. We also, most importantly, have to avoid the kind of disaster that you can see in the bottom right. This is Brumadinho in Brazil, which was a tailings dam collapse of tragic proportions, environmental damage, some 270 people who perished in this disaster. This simply is not permissible anymore. We have to do more to try and avoid this kind of accident and disaster. And the bottom top right picture, of course, is the landscape scale that we need to view this as, that we need to preserve while still building the mine that's over in the far left-hand side. So if we wrap this up, what I wanted to again is emphasize this system thinking that is really the purpose of my talk. So we have to recognize that resources will be required to meet human needs and the technology and so on. So we have to provide them and we have to utilize the materials in order to generate the technologies and so on. So that is a critical driver for the system, and it will return, whether it's a year or 3 years or 4 years, it will return. That requires us to make discoveries, and we have to make discoveries using all the information we have, and then we have to develop those discoveries of resources. And that information, that data, that understanding the earth is a critical part of it. That's understanding the rocks and the minerals, but it's also understanding the environment at the landscape scale that we're going to build or develop a mine in. And of course, that environment also includes people. And so the third bullet here is the need to mitigate. And to Ludovine, I apologize for using the word mitigate, but I don't do it lightly. I mean, we have to fully address and understand in order to mitigate environment, social, governance risks, and use that as the building stones to address sustainable development goals. So we need to focus on efficiency of the operation. The more efficient operation is going to be a better operation, but we have to do that in the context of environment and social performance. And most importantly, and the piece that I really wanted to leave you with, is that we have to do this by connecting across the value chain from the rocks and minerals in the ground, the development of the mine, through to the customer, through to us and our needs and desires. And we have to do that very effectively throughout that chain. And this is a complex system. And we have to understand that complexity. We can't shy away from it. We can't assume that there are panaceas and quick fixes within the system, because by nature, complex systems have problems within them that we cannot see. And they develop and they occur because of the nature of the complexity that's already part of this. To handle this complexity, a key is that we have to break down the silos. So we have to break down the discipline silos that are inherent in our business, from geologists to mineral processors to mining engineers to environmental people. And they are serious silos. They are serious impediments in many cases to the work we do. So it's great to have this conference where you're mixing up, turning a true geologist and mixing me up with a bunch of people who know far more about society and governance than I do. But it's not just about the specialist subject disciplines that need to be broken down. It's the technical, social silos and divide, and it is a divide that needs to be broken down in order that we can have better communication and discussion. And of course, that's what this is all about. And just to illustrate, I too am an optimist supporting Christopher in this challenge. And here, this picture that I leave you with is a reclaimed coal mine, now with obviously a wind farm sitting on it. And that hopefully is a good message for the future. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, John. So in your ears at the moment, you can imagine this phenomenal round of applause for you. And I'm very glad that you are enjoying being in this cross-pollinated world of broken silos where we can all hopefully learn from one another as a whole. So just, I guess, kind of building on that, from your perspective, yes, this is a big complex system. And yes, in order for us to truly become more responsible and make best use of our Earth's resources, where do you think are perhaps some of those biggest blockers or problems, or shall we call them opportunities, that we need to address right now to make sure that we can actually move forward in a responsible manner?
That's a big question, and I don't have a quick answer. I mean, the people. I think the people side of our business is critically important, and at times is somewhat overlooked. It's, we do care about the people in our organizations, and we do certainly make good attempts to address their needs, as well as kind of getting them to work in teams and better work together. So that's we're making progress there, and we are also incorporating obviously social scientists into the resource sector, and they work with us and alongside us and help us to do our work. But we still don't have a willingness to listen very well to each other, and that's probably the biggest impediment, is our ability to listen effectively. As technical people in particular are quite uncomfortable on the social side. They given half a chance, will revert to their technical parts of the business rather than the considering the views of the social scientists and so on. So our attempts to break down those divides, those silos, are really the biggest impediment, and one which we need to do a lot more work on still. And with that, and I'll just, the last thought on that is, we obviously want to educate, or we want the general public to understand what we want to do. We want to be liked. It's kind of uncomfortable being in a space where we know most people think we're terrible. Unless we can talk to each other effectively with our own business, we have little chance of being able to talk effectively to those people outside our business. So again, this view of, we've got to stop thinking about ourselves as special and badly treated, and start listening to people about when they think we're bad, and helping them understand better what it is we do without belittling them.
So we're not special. We're not being treated any worse than anybody else. Perhaps we're being a bit too precious with regards to the way that we communicate amongst ourselves. So I guess in a very an eloquent way of trying to segue across to a question that's come in from Ed's side, who I'm sure you know. He said that you said that mines should get more metal from less rock. What should we be doing to try to ensure that consumers get more usage out of the hard-won metals that go into products which they use day to day? So is there anything we can contribute to that?
Well, I mean, we can all contribute to that by demanding more efficient and effective products that we don't throw away every other year. So, I mean, I think that's a consumer pressure, that's a good part of consumer society that we need to think hard about. And the whole efficiency of how we convert raw materials into products and how we better design our products such that they can be broken apart into their components and recycled is a large area that we need to address. And there are people thinking about this, there are people trying to work on this. You know, it's great that companies want to be responsibly sourcing, but they need to be responsibly producing as well. So they need to convert that responsible source into the most efficient, best used material use product that we can have, and one that can then be pulled apart creatively and returned to be reused and so on. So big challenge. I mean, I think consumers play a big role in that. The mining industry can play some role because the mining industry can offer a means to recycle. Our mining industry has facilities that can take materials, but they have to come in the right form. So the mining industry can put pressure back on the recyclers and the technology producers, give us the material that we can use to return back to the market in metal form again.
Great, thanks, John. And one final question for you, and this is where we're going to really bring it home to the geology side of things. You showed some fantastic diagrams with regards to what is that flow, almost through that value chain of exploring from the rock. And then as geologists, obviously, we're desperately trying to gather more and more data so that we increase the certainty of our understanding of what's underneath the ground. And one of the conversations that's been had a lot at the moment is, okay, so we understand the complexities of understanding what the rock is under the ground. So, you know, something like my little hand specimen that I have here. But then the complexities of piling on the environment, the social, the cultural, the governance, different requirements as a whole. Just, I guess, quickly for everybody, what are some of the things that are maybe being done, or what do you think should be done from a geologist's perspective to try and increase the robustness of how we include all those different aspects?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is, as geologists, we need to be aware of all of those issues right from the beginning. So when we step on the ground, wherever we are, wherever we're exploring, we obviously have to be aware of the social context where we are and the people who live and inhabit, and whether we've met and have their approval to do what we're doing, their permission to do what we're doing. So we have to do that part of it. But at the same time, we have to, as geologists, we have to understand the governance, the jurisdiction, the framework, the governance of our company. We have to work for companies that we believe in. We have to work for companies that have a governance structure that is one that supports us so that we don't have to worry about that on the ground. You know, we don't want to meet people who criticize us. We want to be able to say, no, I work for so-and-so, they do this. So all those pieces we need to have. What can we do? That's much harder in terms of when we pick up a rock, what can we do to the rock? We have to still understand the rock. But I think the last piece, I'll go back to what I said before, we have to expand our framework. We have to be willing to listen to others who tell us about social context, who tell us about governance, and we have to incorporate it in our thinking. So that's tough, because the world's a complicated place, and the system I've described is exceedingly complex. We can't know it all intimately, but we have to be willing to listen to the other people who occupy other parts of it and can help us do our job.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, John. So I love that case of we can't know it all. So we can't be absolutely certain about all of it, but that is no excuse for ignoring key aspects of that complex system that's out there. Brilliant. Okay, so round of imaginary applause for John. I love the fact that on the video I can certainly see some of the other speakers applauding you. So thank you very much, John. We're now going to go across and we're going to come back into Europe from Canada, where John's been sitting. We're going to come back to France, where the wonderful Andy Cher is sitting. And Andy, if you want to unmute yourself, and if you've got slides, now is your opportunity to start sharing them. Andy is now going to, Andy and myself, so we've done lots of work together over the years, and whilst Andy is not a geologist, he is still a wonderful person. Everybody's a wonderful person. And what Andy is going to be talking about is really delving into that, some of those other complex areas that John was mentioning that need to obviously be absolutely integral with regards to how do we ensure that we are mining, processing, buying and selling all of those raw materials in the most responsible way possible. So Andy, Are you able to share your screen? And if not, we will be able to share from our end.
I should be able to, but I'll show it a little bit later. So let's hope it works. Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's great to be joining everybody this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and also for all the hard work that's gone into this. And to my fellow presenters, thank you for giving me a fantastic setup and platform to continue exploring these issues of complexity. So as Sarah may have mentioned earlier, I'm not in London. I'm currently sitting high up in the French Pyrenees in a little village called Courceville. I'd be very surprised if anybody's heard about it. It's not very well known. But it has been producing some of the best quality iron ore since the 2nd century BC. And that continued up until 1986. And at the height, I think there were hundreds of people employed in the mine from various villages. And the little village that you drive through when you come to Courceville was teeming with hotels, bars, cafes, restaurants, and even 2 nightclubs that employed most of the residents of the village. I had the fortune of meeting the last DJ from one of the nightclubs as well. Today, however, there are about a grand total of 5 jobs that still exist within the entire commune. So it's clear that yes, mining can be a real force for good. It can really present host communities and economies as well as governments and societies with huge opportunity for development and for improvement by converting natural capital into economic capital. But it can also have very long-lasting and negative consequences if a lot of these issues that we've been discussing today are not thought of early enough and well enough in order for us to make the right decisions across the life cycle of the mine. So what I'd like to try to do today is just set out how companies actually start thinking about all of these different constraints and issues across the entire life cycle, and what opportunities exist where we might be able to start to think differently and do things differently and start to bring all of these complex issues together. I will also touch a little bit on the concept of closure, because I think it's important to really understand what are things going to look like at the end of the mine. There's so much thinking about how do we find mines, how do we develop mines, how do we extract the ore, but actually it's probably not really for most of our lifetimes that we'll be thinking about closing it. Many mines, I mean, the mine just behind me up on the mountain has been mined for 2,000 years, quite successfully, until things changed. And I'll get into a little bit about that and how we can maybe do that differently. So I'm going to try to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work. It didn't work earlier, but let's give it a go. Just checking, can you see that? Great.
Perfect.
So once the geologists like Sarah and John and others have found a deposit that looks interesting during the exploration phase, the next step is really about saying, well, what options exist for us to extract this ore? They'll run an options analysis process then with techno-economists in the pre-feasibility, select obviously the most valuable option, and that goes through to a feasibility stage study where there'll be some refinement going on. Things will start to look a little bit less good than they did because we've got more information, as John was mentioning. We understand a little bit more about the ore body, but also the constraints that are being placed on us by society, by the environment, by regulations, etc. But eventually there'll be some optimization to that design, and we get something that's good to go for a construction point of view, where we say, right, well, this is what we think the value of this mine is, by taking all of the future cash flows, so the costs and the revenues, putting those all into an NPV model or net present value model, which says, right, this is our best guesstimate of what this mine is worth. Let's go ahead and start constructing it. But Sarah, as you know, and most other people involved, things very, very seldom go 100% according to plan. So what happens when things go wrong? Well, it sometimes depends when they go wrong. If something goes wrong in construction and there's a delay, either due to a technical issue or due to, let's say, someone was starting to construct now during a COVID pandemic lockdown, or there's community protest, and that delays the construction of the mine by just a few months, it can have a very, very significant impact on the value of the mine. Throughout the operation, there'll be a whole host of unforeseen or unwanted events that will happen, and that will decrease the value, but there'll also be some upswings. So there could be shortages of a commodity, and that will give us an upswing in the price. So we have some negative or some positive risks as well, which will be resulting at the end of the life of mine with a value that's a little bit closer to what we imagined it would be, which is great news. Then it comes to closure. And we say, right, well, when we were building this mine, this is what we thought we were going to have to do to close it. When we were operating it, this was the framework that we were existing under. But now things have changed. Actually, there's this thing called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Society's not so happy with what we were planning to do in order to close it. And it's unfortunately going to cost us so much more to close it. So just to be clear, closing a mine is easy, but responsible closure, which means we fulfilled all of our obligations, the mine isn't polluting the environment, and there isn't a major damage to society at the end of the mine, is much harder to do. One way of mitigating this risk is to make sure that the mine is positioned in the correct area of the cost curve for the industry. So very quickly, just to show you an example from copper, this is from 2017. I think prices are more or less similar at the moment. Really, what you want to be is a producer that's somewhere over here in the cost curve. So that means you are able to produce a ton of copper at a low cost relative to what it's selling for in the market. Where you don't want to be is over here on the right-hand side of the graph, where it's costing you more to produce copper than you can actually sell it for. But unfortunately, if your costs go up, and they tend to go up at the end of the life of mine, or the price comes down, then you see a lot more mines being potentially forced to close early, not because they've run out of ore, but because it's no longer economically feasible to extract that ore. So this is the complexity that that mining companies need to deal with today. And nobody said that it was easy, and it seems to be a moving feast, and everybody's got an opinion on what to do. The reality is that it is very different for every single mine. The constraints, the social, the environmental constraints are very different. So being able to think long-term about what things might look like so that we don't work ourselves out of any options by the way in which we are exploiting a mine, I think is the key thing. What we ideally need to do is to try to understand what is the true cost of operating and closing a mine responsibly, so that we can make fully informed decisions along the life cycle. So should we build this mine in the first place? Or are there better opportunities now that we understand what the constraints are and the true cost will be? And secondly, how do our short and medium term mine plans take into consideration all of the technical and economic constraints, but also the social, environmental, and governance constraints that are increasing on mines? If we take, for example, the cost of social closure, this is something that most mines will consider, a severance package for employees at the end of the life of mine. But what if they are then suddenly held to account by stakeholders to say, actually, we're going to require an economic relocation of people at the end of the life of mine because there is nothing else. And this is quite conceivable in governments and countries where the economies are heavily dependent on mining. Botswana and Mongolia, for example, without mining, there's not a lot left. So given the complexity that we were already finding ourselves in, the current COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted I think how fragile our just-in-time economy has become to major shocks. The global economy really seems to operate in a permanent state of metastability, and it really relies on absolutely nothing going wrong so that it can deliver the growth and the returns that were promised to shareholders. Whilst it's probably too early to tell exactly how the crisis will affect the mining industry, I think one thing is certain. The world has really had a chance to pause and take stock of the impact that we and our consumption has on the planet and our future. So things are definitely not going to be the same going forward. I'm not sure whether the pause and the correction to global stock markets will allow companies to shift from the current short-termism to long-term thinking, which is crucial in an industry like mining, which is making decisions for 100 years' time. But I really am not sure which alternative future today's history is going to opt for: increased growth or increased stability. There may be no definitive answers to this, but I really hope that we will make the right choices, because what is acceptable to society is changing. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Andy. I think that was a fantastic talk, building on what we've already heard earlier on today, and giving us an awful lot of food for thought with regards to, yes, is it that increased growth or that increased stability? Because you're not going to get both in equal measure. So actually, where's the balancing point with regards to that? Now, there have been a number of questions coming in during your talk, you will be glad to know. And one of them actually is around some of the chatter that's going on YouTube at the moment. So yes, Rose and I are multitasking and looking at all the different feeds that are coming in. And actually the chatter around YouTube is almost focusing in on, well, you mentioned that it's easy to close a mine, but it's far more difficult to do it responsibly. So therefore, what does a responsibly closed mine actually look like?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I think, again, it depends on the mine and the environment that it finds itself in. So I think one survey of 57 mines that had closed in the last 70 years showed that about 9% of those mines were closed, officially closed. They had a closure certificate from the government that says you fulfilled all your obligations. So that normally means that it's not actively polluting the environment, or that the pollution levels are acceptable, is perhaps a better way of saying that. But again, the requirements for what is considered a closed mine are ever increasing. So what was acceptable 60, 70, 100 years ago is certainly not acceptable today. There are many examples across Europe where it's the current councils, it's us today that are paying for some of the practices that happened in the past. And I think really what a responsibly closed mine looks like is it's something that leaves the area better off than it was before mining commenced. And that for me is really the core essence of sustainable development. Development is about improvement. Sustainable means that it's making things better. We're not borrowing from the future in order to have a cushier today, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much for that, Andy. So we're looking at something that is better in the future and also for the long term. So we're not just thinking the next 10, 20 years, we are indeed thinking of that long-term basis as well. So with that, and this is maybe then coming back into your question around, or your concept of unforeseen events and that complexity, building on what John was saying. This is a question from Ruth, and she asks, in your experience, what proportion of unforeseen events influencing value during construction and operation were actually unforeseen rather than just missed or ignored? And could the lack of foresight of where we'd end up indicate a lack of effective governance at the exploration, pre-feasibility and various feasibility stages?
Well, without delving in any details, the last decade, I've evaluated a number of very, very significant risks that have happened to mines. So they are now facts, they're no longer risks. Almost every single one of those was present on the risk register. So it's not that these were unforeseen events. Even COVID-19, one of the presidents mentioned a few years ago that this is an imminent reality for us and we need to be prepared for it. So I think the reality is that so many things that happen are foreseen, but the assumptions that we use are often very optimistic, sometimes overly optimistic. And this is normal. I think there's a psychological concept called optimism bias. And optimistic people tend to be successful people that tend to have very high flying jobs where they get to make very important decisions. So it's really not necessarily a case of these things are not known. I think there's just a huge reliance on hope that they're not going to happen, or that they're certainly not going to happen on my watch. And yes, it's not possible to protect against everything. It's too costly to protect against everything. But being on the right, in the correct area of the cost curve, so having a mind that gives you a little bit of contingency if things do go wrong, I think is critically important. So we aren't just really cutting it to the wire to say, well, you know, I can deal with 2 days of outage, but certainly not 2 weeks or 2 months. So giving yourself that comfort level, I think, is critical, especially when you're wanting to reduce the amount of risk, or at least the impact that risks would have on the longevity and the sustainability of the mine.
So making sure that the asset that you are mining is just better than everybody else's, so giving you more wiggle room.
or getting more metal out of less rock.
So Andy, last question, I think for you, and please everybody keep all your questions coming on whichever channel you're pushing at us from. This question comes from Ansu, and what Ansu says is, given the volatility of commodity prices and the effect on that cost curve that we've just been discussing, from your experience, would you recommend that regulators should demand a more progressive mine closure implementation? And if so, how do you think that would play out from the perspective of project economics?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think it's critical that we need to level the playing field, because it's not really fair to ask responsible miners to put money aside for the future and irresponsible miners to not do that. Now, there are some governments around the world that do require closure funds. Those are normally focused on environmental cleanup, but there are more and more that are requiring social closure costs to be set aside for. So when it comes to closure liabilities, what you'll typically see on most income statements at the moment is focused very much on environmental rehabilitation. But I think more and more there's an understanding that we can't have this boom bust phenomenon where suddenly we're employing thousands of people, we've got massive influx of people into an area. When that mine is gone, whose problem is that? That's then the government's. And governments are saying, well, we can't afford to cover that cost either. So I think this is really about making sure that there is a win-win strategy that's developed from the outset to say, well, how can the mine, who's taking on all of the risk, and their shareholders, work together with local communities, with other stakeholders, with governments to say, what are we going to do at the end of this mine? What are the options available to us so that we really use the benefits that the ore gives to us to create a better today and a better future as well?
Fantastic. A good note to finish on there, Mr. Chair, sir. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause for you and for everybody, from everybody around the world. So thank you very, very much, Andy. That was great. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go from the wonderful foothills of the Pyrenees, and we're going to go back to Vancouver again, and the wonderful Susan Joyce, who is going to talk to us about the wonderful world of human rights. Now, Susan, if I've got this right, I'm going to be sharing your slides for you. Is that correct?
Yes, thanks. I'd appreciate that. We have some challenges on internet connectivity in rural British Columbia. Thanks, Sarah. So before, just as an opening, I want to say that Andy's presentation couldn't have been more perfect a segue into what I want to talk about. If you think about the graph that he put up about all that early decision-making process and the optionality early on, One of the main points that I want to make about changing the decision framework for in terms of how we look at social and environmental ecosystem impacts and switching that lens to a human right lens is exactly what Andy's arguing for. That and my point would be that early on, when you can factor in some of these critical questions about how the rights of people may be affected by the project at all, and also by the different options, the different alternatives that you have for how it's developed. If that doesn't happen early on, prior to, when those optionalities are being evaluated and when the decisions are not yet made, by the time, for example, that we get to an EIA process, which is much later in the evolution of the decision-making process, and more importantly, the investment curve for miners, so much money has been invested behind a project. There is so much momentum and need to move ahead with projects if they look good economically, that it's very, very hard at that point in time to say no, to say it's a no-go in terms of social or human rights issues, cultural values. So what I'm proposing in terms of trying to break a little bit from the EIA and environmental regulatory process as sort of the key point in time when we look at potential impacts is pulling that process forward, perfectly aligned with what Andy just presented. So I'll take the first slide, Sarah, thanks.
Oh.
There we go. And human rights is brought into the picture in a context where even the conflict is still very common within extractive industries, in particular mining. This picture is from the Bagua conflict in Peru quite a few years ago now. And that even though the Sustainable Development Goals and other initiatives like social impact investing are quite visible, they're quite hot trends right now. In particular, many companies are bringing on board the Sustainable Development Goals. They can't be, you have to remember that the underbelly or the underpinning of that has to be an adequate understanding of the potential risks and impacts. It's not enough to provide benefits to try to fulfill Sustainable Development Goals if the impact side and the people who are actually experiencing the impacts, if that's not addressed. Investors are a really important part of this scenario. They're part of what is driving the attention to human rights and its increasing uptake. And I'll talk about that a little bit further, the power of the investor community in this. Next slide. So a brief introduction to the business and human rights framework. In 2011, the UN Human Rights Commission endorsed the guiding principles on business and human rights, which have 3 pillars, and established the difference in roles and responsibilities, most importantly between the state and the private sector. So it really helped to frame out for the private sector what it needs to do. So there's the pillar of protection by the state, and the new pillar, which was identified from that point going forward, which is the responsibility of the private sector to respect human rights. And third, both the state and the private sector have a role in establishing the remedy sector and ensuring that victims have access to effective remedy. And we'll talk about that a bit. I was trying to advance my slides. Can you give me the next one, please? So the fundamentals of bringing human rights into private sector responsibility, and in particular in the extractives, is this model of due diligence with respect for human rights. And one of the points that I wanted to make, in particular with reference to a number of the previous presentations, is what human rights does more than any other framework is it puts preventing harm to people right at the center of the decision-making process and the data gathering. But not only does it do that, it prioritizes the voice of the people who are potentially affected, and ensures that when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about benefits, we're not talking about our idea as miners of what will benefit them in the long term, or even the government's idea of what benefits or modernization should look like for them. What we're talking about is bringing the process home, and from the beginning, understanding the values and the visions that local people whose rights are at risk have of what they want their future to look like. And mining may not be compatible with that. And we know a number of cases where people have said it's incompatible with how they see their future. But responsible mining, responsible raw material development may be very, very consistent with the vision and the values base of others. So it's critical that human rights also changes the lens in terms of whose values need to be looked at. Next slide. The human rights framework, since it was introduced in 2011, has had extraordinary support and endorsement from industry associations, from international agencies, and I think really importantly, and I want to point this out, from the increasingly growing community of responsible investors. If you'll notice, the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, based on their website and information that I've been able to find, that organization today represents investors who have more than probably close to $80 trillion under their control. I was recently involved on the expert panel for the Global Tailings Review, which developed is developing a global tailings standard. And the role of the investment community in that was very, very powerful. So it's an important driver in this process in terms of the increasing uptake and attention to human rights. Sarah, next slide. So just a couple of the key points from John Ruggie, who developed the UN Guiding Principles, and that is that it's, I think the most important one is that it's not enough in some cases to be passive and to say that we're not doing any harm. There are contexts in which where a company is present, where its activities are interacting with and changing, affecting background conditions. The companies may need to do more than ensure they're not actively doing harm. They may need to actively work on their interaction with the context, if the context is causing harm. But in general, the overall framework is very well developed and was done with a lot of broad consultation. Next point, Sarah. So I think it's something that the industry in general has not understood, and most people who haven't worked in human rights don't understand that human rights is very much of an evolving framework. Not only this shows the timeline of some of the key legislative and international standards, but our understanding of what are human rights is also evolving. There's an emerging clarity around environmental rights, for example, and water standing on its own in terms of an environmental right. And what we look at here, as we've moved from voluntary principles and voluntary standards, even the UN guiding principles are voluntary, what we're seeing is an evolution toward hard law, which is actual development of regulatory frameworks. Next slide, Sarah. So looking concretely at what that tension is and what does human rights bring to it, just to go through a couple of examples, the human rights lens is a much broader, a much deeper lens than, say, even environmental and social impact assessment, even in the context of, say, the IFC performance standards, which are the most important framework out there. This slide looks at a number of ways in which bringing a human rights lens and bringing that lens much earlier in the project. And I would say pre-feasibility, when the first boots go on the ground. Sarah knows I'm an advocate of this kind of look at the human rights context at the time that exploration and prospecting has taken place, so that you know what you're looking at, and there's no surprises for the mining company either. But these are ways in which the human rights lens requires a broader look and beyond what the regulatory framework of an EIA process can give you. So without going into detail, hopefully you'll all get a chance to see this if you want to follow up. Next slide. So from managing impacts, which is the way the impact of a project is done, to respecting rights, we're talking about really bringing the time frame forward, and we're talking about understanding and giving the ability of people in a place to articulate and define what are the values to them, and what needs to be protected in the environment, what needs to be in place for them to continue to operate. This is an example of some high-level thoughts about balancing rights with the decision to make a mine, and what would shift in the way we make decisions and how we prioritize things if human rights are really being taken into consideration. A good example here is collective and prior agreement, for example, on the conditions of water use by a mine, and how that water use or the investment in water resources can actually contribute to improving water resources for the region as a whole. But understanding that use and access to water is a much broader and more complex issue than what the government issuing of permits may be, and that the needs of the local people and their reliance on the local ecosystems has to be fundamentally part of that decision-making process. And again, earlier, as per Andy's graph. So that, next slide. That's my presentation. Actually, you can leave this one up. I've lost the screen, so I assume that we're done, but that's it for the presentation. I hope I've made some of these points, brought them to life a little bit for you.
Absolutely fantastic, brilliant. Thank you very much, Susan. So yes, you can imagine that round of applause going on in your mind. And as the questions come in for you, so you can see that again, we've switched gears. We're now looking at perhaps one of the most complex areas that we need to be considering when we're talking about those natural resources around the human rights aspect. And a question just to get us going, Susan, and you were beginning to touch on it towards the end. Where do you see this, I guess, this tension in human rights between where there might be an opportunity to make a change to something in someone's frame of reference? So say, for example, there's the opportunity to extract copper out of the ground within an area in which someone lives, and through that you actually might make the availability of water slightly less variable because you're actually putting in the infrastructure. So you've got the opportunity for change, I guess, versus people not wanting to disturb a way of life that is occurring within that particular environment. How do you begin to get to grips with that and begin to balance that up before you even go into an area to undertake any real work to see if there's really anything there from a raw materials perspective?
That's an easy question, Sarah. That's a tough one, and I think a lot of it, at least my experience working in a number of countries in Latin America, suggests that what underpins a lot of the, not all obviously, but what underpins some of the opposition and fear associated with raw material extraction, with mining in particular, is the legacy of environmental and health damage that historical mining has done. And it's a question of being able to, if you're a responsible operator, how do you build a basis of confidence much earlier in the process so that people can begin to understand that mineral development in this particular context, in this particular day and age, is going to involve a different flow of opportunities for local people. It's going to involve long-term responsibility, like the other speakers have talked about, but building a framework in which local needs and issues are going to be seriously considered and taken on board, and not subjugated or subordinated to what's generally perceived as private sector gain at the expense of local people and government priorities for resource development. And the human rights lens, speaking from the perspective of the mining company, provides mechanisms for understanding where the tensions are going to be early on. And it allows, if it's fully integrated and part of the decision-making framework, it gives investors some confidence that the project itself is not going to be, the project itself and the state, who is often very much at fault in terms of promoting extractive economic models, that these are not going to be bulldozing the rights of local people, local communities, local landowners in exchange for establishing an extractive project on site. So it's extremely complex, and it's different in every country, but it's got to start from building a confidence base that responsible mining is not going to operate the way traditional mining did. And I find, where I have worked, that the human rights framework, the human rights lens, changes the consideration so significantly that people do develop trust, even in very low trust contexts. People do begin, when it's fully followed through on, they begin to see a different possible path forward.
So you mentioned the word trust there, Susan, which I think is so critical with regards to this aspect. And again, this is not a very good segue, but Aldo's just asked a great question, which is there a gap or tension between what governments require for permitting and human rights expectations placed by stakeholders on companies? What do you think with regards to that?
It's enormous, and that's the gist of the shift from managing impacts to respecting rights, is to say that coming in with a project that has a premise of having negative impacts on people and managing them, and that the trade-off has to be to sort of buy sufficient support by putting enough money into projects. If you're going to respect rights, you have to begin talking to people early on. And that's why I think the regulatory framework is so limiting, because so many companies only think of, it's crazy. We know early engagement is important, but having substantive discussions about what a mine might look like and how the post-mining environment is going to ensure, for example, the sustainability of their lives and their values, their culture, looking at the full life cycle of the mine from beginning to end, which is a way of demonstrating respect for rights by recognizing that they will be there when you close and you will be gone. So the legal regulatory requirements are extremely limited, and they're also, they're in many cases far below the bar of the international standards, which to some degree have incorporated human rights questions and concerns, but again, without necessarily being able to pull them to that early phase where those key questions need to be asked and go into the decision-making model that Andy was talking about.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Susan. We're going to have to stop you there. I could keep asking you questions all day. But again, round of applause for Susan. Thank you very, very much. That was fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to switch gear actually a little bit, and a lot of us have mentioned reporting and how do we measure sustainability, etc. as a whole. And we're now going to go across to Pierre, who is an expert in all of this. So Pierre, if you want to take yourself off mute just so that we can check that your sound is working. And we're going to go across to Pierre, and Pierre is going to take us through some of the developments in the world of how do we ascertain if a company is truly acting in a sustainable fashion, and how do they share that intelligence, etc., with the world round about us. So Pierre, without further ado, we're going to come across to yourself, and thank you very much.
Hello there. Can you see my screen just to check before everything?
We can indeed, sir. Thank you.
Okay, great. Right, so hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending when you are on the planet. It's really great to contribute to the conference. So thank you, Sarah, and the team for having put together such a great program together. So my name is Pierre de Pasquale. I'm the head of stakeholder engagement at the Responsible Mining Foundation in Switzerland. And I'm obviously calling you from home today, as most of us are still confined and working remotely. So today I'll use some of our results, the results of our latest RMI report 2020 to illustrate how the SDGs could be much more than a reporting burden for mining companies, and actually help address key issues. We always hear about the reporting fatigue, and there's more and more reporting. So how do we actually look into the issues? So first, just a very brief introduction to RMF for those who may be not familiar with the organization. At RMF, we believe that responsible mining should benefit the economies, improve the lives of peoples, and respect the environment of producing countries, while allowing for companies and investors to make a fair and viable return. Well, our organization was established before the SDGs were finalized, but our vision summarizes well how the SDGs apply to the mining industry. So one of our main focus is large-scale mining companies and assessing how they address ESG issues. So by the way, you'll often hear me talk about ESG. We've added an extra E that stands for economic development. So on this slide, you see the RMI framework 2020, which contains all the topics, indicators, metrics we use, together with examples of relevant kinds of evidence, which is very useful also for companies, for investors, banks, governments, and all the stakeholders. So this is available for free in 6 languages. And we cover 6 main thematic areas: economic development, business conduct, life cycle management, working conditions, community well-being, and environmental responsibility. So now the RMI report 2020 that we have published in February this year is an evidence-based assessment, and it is an application of this framework, or if you like, an illustration of how one can apply this very comprehensive framework to some of the largest mining companies in the world. So on this world map, you see the geographic scope of our report. So we have assessed 38 mining companies that together account for 28% of the global value of mining production. So they have under the control about 1,000 mine sites, which are all the dots you see on the map. About 800 of them are active, and they have at least 200 closed or suspended sites that we know about. So all the individual reports are available on our website. So now I'll dive into some of the results with you, and in particular, today's focus on the SDGs. And so what about the SDGs? So first of all, and this is one of our key findings, there is a risk of SDG washing. So it is, what do we mean by that? Well, it's good and encouraging to see that more companies are referencing the SDGs in their ESG reporting. It's a nice framework. It's been internationally approved. And one example is clean water and sanitation, which gets used a lot by large companies to report on various social programs and investments to build sanitation facilities and potable water infrastructures, for example. But actually, this often hides part of the reality, with very limited information disclosed on the impacts of the mining activities on the water quality around the mine sites, for example. And similarly, information is largely missing on the impacts of those mining companies on life below water and other mining impacts that can actually impede the realization of some SDGs. So now we can illustrate that with some results on water taken from the RMI report. So you can see here reasonable results on water quantity. So the 38 blue bars, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the blue bars on this chart represent the ranking of scores of the 38 companies. Well, so this ranking shows that most companies are actually tracking and reporting on their water consumption levels, then reviewing these levels and taking actions to reduce the water consumption. And this is where the contrast between materiality and salience comes to play, because water is clearly a material issue of crucial importance to the business to ensure continuation of the operations, right? But now if we look at water quality, you see a striking difference. So there are, half of the bars are not here, no scores, no information. So very few companies are actually tracking and reporting on the quality of the water, reviewing their actions and acting to reduce their impacts in and around their mine sites. And the quality of water on site and downstream the operations is clearly a very salient issue for other industries, agriculture, affected communities, and the surrounding environment. But this gets a lot less attention from mining companies. Although many companies report on their projects on clean water, very few companies provide meaningful data on their impacts on water quality. Now, I'll take you to other topics, other issues on gender, which is a transversal issue in the framework. You can see here a striking contrast again. So on the left-hand side, those are the results on improving gender balance at board and senior management levels. And most companies are making an effort on that. But in the contrast on the right-hand chart, very few companies are showing systematic actions to make sure that women workers are provided with gender-appropriate PPE. And this, of course, is a much more fundamental issue of health and safety at the mine site level. Looking now at another issue related to mine workers. So here we show the extent to which companies are planning ahead to ensure a just transition for workers after mine closure. And it is a huge issue to ensure economic viability of workers' households. And there's extremely limited information or evidence that companies are addressing these issues. As a comparison, on the left-hand side, you see they're paying much more attention to developing strategies for just transition for affected communities after closure, which is encouraging. But again, it raised the concern that not all stakeholders are included. Turning now to tailings, showing you some results on two of our indicators. So this first indicator shows very encouraging results, one of the best scoring across the RMI report, in terms of companies making publicly available key data on location and safety of their tailings storage facilities. So about half of the companies show full score And you can actually see in light purple the clear effect of the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative led by the Church of England Pension Board and the Swedish Council of Ethics for AP funds. So all those companies submitted full public responses, and that's encouraging. But and there's a but again, there's good results, contrasts, which the much weaker results that we see on tracking and reporting on the management of tailings related risks, and then auditing, reviewing the effectiveness of the measures taken, and implementing corrective actions. Those scores are almost the same as what we saw in 2018 in the previous report, and not a single company scored higher than 50%. So more data is fine, it's a good crucial step, but where it gets to actually effective management procedures and management systems and continuous improvement, there's hardly any information. I'll just finish with another hot topic before we open to questions, which is climate change. Here we see a similar pattern on this chart. You see that most companies are reporting, tracking their greenhouse gases emissions and reviewing the measures they take to reduce their emissions. Well, first of all, on those emissions, it's one thing to track and set targets, but I'm sure you know there was a recent report published by the Transition Pathway Initiative that found that most of the world's largest mining companies are not doing enough to reduce their emissions, and the current efforts will not be enough to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. So while this is very concerning, but our results point to another major gap in mining companies' response to climate change. Very few companies actually report on how they plan and consider the effect of climate change in exacerbating the impacts they have on communities, workers, and environments. So you'll find some information, there are strategies and plans in place to adapt the business to climate change to ensure continuity in production, profitability of the operations, which is again a material issue to the business, but the salient issue of risk to others is clearly not addressed and not reported. So this was just a small extract of some of our report, but it gives you a brief snapshot of how SDGs are being integrated in the mining business, and how by looking beyond the materiality lens and traditional risk analysis, you could embed the SDGs in core management approach. And again, back to some of Susan's points on early engagement, including all the stakeholders, building trust, showing respect, acting as a good neighbor. And so in 12 minutes, we've covered at least 10 SDGs. So that's it for me. It's going to be great to reflect on that now. Thanks. Great,
thank you very, very much, Pierre. Imagine if we'd given you more time, you would have got through all of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's great. So just with this, Pierre, I mean, I think, this is a fantastic data set. And I think all of us enjoy looking at the reports that you guys produce because they're always very, very rich with information. And I'm sure that there are lots of questions that people have with regards to them. One question from myself is, with the kind of the difference that you're seeing, be it on water, so the kind of the initial reporting around whether water's available, and then the lack of reporting really around water quality, and then the same as what you showed with the gender or the workers, post-closure, tailings, etc. Is there a correlation between those who are providing the reporting, i.e. the data sets, and the size of the mining operator? Do you see a correlation there, or is there no correlation at all?
No, and this is probably one of the most striking finding of this report, because we've also applied a number of indicators at the mine site level, and not a single company was able to show consistent scores between the operations we selected. And there's really no correlation between the country of operation, the size of the mine site, the commodity that's being mined, and we cover more than 50 commodities. It's really quite concerning, or at least strange to notice that the information that's available at the mine site in particular is clearly not systematized by mining companies. So it seems to depend on parameters such as the willingness of the mine managers, or one side that may have been under more public scrutiny, or local regulations, track record, etc., etc. So there's no correlation, at least in this relatively small sample, because that's only 1,000 mine sites and 38 companies, but nothing really here.
So what some people may have seen come through on the chat just now is Ludovine, who's obviously been our governance expert on this session's calls, has just said governance failure, ! With regards to putting in those numbers. But Pierre, can you take a guess as to why people find it difficult to pull together these numbers to report them? Why is it?
Yeah. So we've had a chance to have individual debrief calls also with most of the companies now, and asking them exactly those questions. What are the barriers? There are two things here to differentiate. One is the actual gaps, so things that companies are not doing, and a number of them do acknowledge that they're not addressing everything in the most responsible way at the moment. It's a very complex issue. If you want to address everything, it's going to take time. So this is why we encourage continuous improvement. The sector is not going to change overnight. So there are the gaps. And then secondly, yeah, those barriers where you're actually doing things and implementing responsible practices, but you're not able to share the information. And remember that all our results are a reflection of what companies can demonstrate. So they may be doing other things, but they're not able to share the information. Well, one of the problems seems to be really the corporate culture of a very high confidentiality culture that is understandable on business sensitive, security sensitive issues, but all our indicators and most of the work done in the ESG field relates to public interest information. So really here we need a paradigm shift in how companies relate to transparency. And being a mining engineer myself, something I say all the time, I know at many mine sites, for example, there is real-time environmental monitoring. So the information is being captured, but it gets lost and it's aggregated at the corporate level. It goes to the sustainability department somewhere in London or Sydney or Toronto, and you only get one figure that's actually not meaningful, which is, for example, the recycling rate of water for the whole of Latin America when you have 40 mine sites. And no one can really use that, neither the mine managers, neither the investors, neither the affected communities, the governments, the lenders, the workers. So there's crucial need here to change this relation to disclosure of information.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much, Pierre. We very much value you sharing this insight with us today. And with your permission, Pierre, what we'll do as well on the website for the responsible raw materials, we'll put a link across to this report. So if people want to go and find it, I'm sure you are more than capable of using a search engine of your choice, which will make it nice and easy for you as well, because this report only came out, when was it released, Pierre?
In February this year. Yeah.
Excellent. So you just beat COVID. So congratulations on
Thank
that
you.
one. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pierre. So now you've got your round of applause that you can hear ringing in your ears.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, mate. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move across to Hugo Brody, who comes to us from the London Metal Exchange. So Hugo, if you want to find your unmute button, that's it. Congratulations. So Hugo comes to us from within the CEO office at the London Metal Exchange. Hugo focuses on responsible sourcing, warehouse reform, and new strategic projects. So Hugo, of course, brings a different slant with regards to what we're talking about here today. Without further ado, Hugo, across to yourself. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. That's my first big thank you. My second is my apologies for having such unkempt hair. It's my quarantine hair. So hopefully as soon as I'm released, I can get a haircut as well. So forgive me for that. So as stated, my name is Hugo Brody. I work in the CEO office, as you just said. So we've got a strange team in that we look after projects that our two chief executives like to keep very close and take a particular interest in. And I think it's fairly safe to say that responsible sourcing in the last 2 years has been one of the main projects that has drawn a lot of our focus in our team anyway. So the big question for those of you on this Zoom call today is, firstly, well, what is the LME? And secondly, why on earth would a company that buys no metal, well, maybe some spoons in our office kitchen, but owns no mines and is non-NGO or charity care that metal should be sourced responsibly? And why would you, say, if you're a consumer or a producer of metals, care about the LME taking action? So, and when we say responsibly at the exchange, we mean that the metal has not been sourced with the use of the worst forms of child labor or to fund conflict. Well, in a nutshell, we're a futures exchange of the world's largest market in options and futures contracts for base metals. And in order to understand why responsible sourcing is so important to us, I thought it was useful to give a little information as to what is the exchange and what makes us so unique. So first of all, what metals do we have on the exchange, and what metal supply chains will be included within our responsible sourcing initiative? So it started with copper and tin back in the 19th century from Chile and Malaysia, followed by lead and zinc just after the First World War. The late 70s brought aluminium or aluminum, wherever you are in the world, which today is our most liquid contract. And my colleague used to say that the ALI contracts used to keep the lights on at the LME. So nickel came a year later, is also a very large contract, particularly the rise of electric vehicles, the electric vehicle battery boom. Cobalt followed in 2010, another key metal in electric vehicles, but also one that often has a heightened risk profile when it comes to responsible sourcing. And then from 2015, we made our foray into ferrous metals with steel scrap, cash settled contracts, and 2017 gold and silver precious metal contracts. But the crucial thing to note here is that our responsible sourcing requirements are only for our listed brands in copper, cobalt, lead, nickel, tin, aluminium, namely the metals that you can actually have delivered to you when you take delivery of an LME contract, and one in which we manage and operate a metals brands list. So those are our metals, but what service do we actually perform, and for who? So the first one is pricing, and hopefully many people on the call have seen the LME price for metals and the price generated by those on our trading floor. Well, currently, actually, it's electronic pricing, so it's there's no trading floor for the third time in 100 years, so we're pricing electronically, but it works the same way. That price is used in procurement contracts globally. The second is hedging, so people who use the exchange can protect against volatile price movements, and we've seen some particularly volatile markets in the last 2 months. So anecdotally, March was our highest volume month in years, to give you an idea of what's going on at the moment. But finally, and the reason why we're a little unique, but also why our price is seen as so useful to people around the world, is this delivery component. So when a futures contract comes to expiry on our market, it's possible actually to take delivery from one of our licensed warehouses around the world. It's often as a last resort, but metal that meets LME requirements, which up until now has only been metallurgical and chemical composition, can also be delivered onto the exchange. And this is vital for banks, traders, and producers. So as an example, a very quick example, if a bank finances a trader's metal, they will often insist to the trader or give preferential rates that the metal is LME deliverable. So in this way, if a trader goes bankrupt or insolvent and the bank ends up owning the metal, they can immediately deliver it into the LME warehouse network and receive the LME price for that metal, making it lower risk for them. So that's why being LME deliverable is so crucial to so many mining companies, as banks will often refuse to enter into repurchasing, financing arrangements, pledge arrangements, if the metal is not LME listed and doesn't meet the LME requirements. So similarly, because of this physical delivery component, people who use the LME price can be assured that users are willing to take delivery of metal for that actual price. And that's why the exchange pricing is so valuable. And this delivery can be in any of our licensed warehouses in North America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia. So we've got good global coverage. So we have a global price. We have quite a far reach. So responsible sourcing. So we've been working with a variety of industry bodies regarding the responsible sourcing of minerals for several years. And in 2017, we conducted a comprehensive responsible sourcing survey with all of our producers. That's around 349 different mining companies. And in October 2018, we set out a proposed approach to responsible sourcing to the markets, to which we received extensive feedback. And so from this, there followed a detailed analysis of the feedback. The LME released a formal market-wide consultation in April 2019, the responses to which have helped us shape the final set of requirements, ethical requirements, for all LME listed brands in respect of responsible sourcing. So as I said before, for over a century, the LME has only stipulated metallurgical requirements for brands. So we're changing our approach, and while we don't change our approach lightly, we now believe the right time is for responsible sourcing principles to be embedded in our rules. So where we are currently is we're engaging with all of our producers to make sure they're going to be ready for LME compliance, and hopefully the vast majority who we know are doing good work will remain LME brands. So why are we doing this? So why now? There's three key reasons. So first of all, we do believe as an industry, and the LME is especially, we have a collective ethical responsibility. We believe that our industry has an ethical imperative to embrace the principles of responsible sourcing, and therefore the LME, by our nature of just being at the center of the market, being the linchpin between the physical and the financial world, has a key role in facilitating this. The LME is obviously a seller's market, which means that a buyer of metal through the exchange may be delivered metal of any LME listed brand anywhere in the world. And we can't accept a situation where consumers are required to take delivery of metal which has not been sourced responsibly. So that's the first reason. The second reason, frankly, we have a commercial imperative as well. So the fundamental service of the LME is to price metals, and we live and die by our price. And by the nature of our market, the LME price will generally be the price of the least valuable brand on our brands list. So we have to act to ensure that our price reflects the value of responsibly sourced metal and is not artificially depressed by metal which is not sourced in this manner, which is, for want of a better term, irresponsibly sourced. So we've listened to calls from our market, and this brings into the final reason why we're doing this, or main reason, is we believe that we're best placed to provide leadership for the global metals industry, for at least those who list brands on the LME, again, because we sit at the center of the market. So it's clear our stakeholders now all demand responsible sourcing, and we feel that we have to collectively live up to our responsibilities. So we've listened to calls, and now we're taking a leading role in responsible sourcing. So what are the key features of what we're doing? So as I alluded to before, it will now be a requirement for every producer of an LME listed brand to due diligence their supply chains in respect of responsible sourcing if they want to remain an LME brand. So a key feature of our requirements that we want to build on the well-established work in the sector, and it was clear a huge amount of work has already been undertaken in the responsible sourcing space, and we want to build on this and provide a framework by which the industry can benefit from this investment. So in particular, the LME's approach is grounded in the OECD guidance, which in our view is the most globally relevant approach to responsible sourcing. And this then allows brands to make use of existing standards that have been based on the OECD guidance as well. So we've tried to be pragmatic. And because these standards define audit approaches, the most appropriate auditors will be positioned to assess compliance as well. So I realise I'm at the end of my 10 minutes, but if you want to hear more, I'll be giving a webinar going into more detail. So I'll be speaking tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. and you can register from our website. But hopefully now you have more of an idea of what we're doing. And going forward, when you see an LME brand in any metal, any of our metals, you'll know not only has there been chemical due diligencing, but also ethical due diligencing as well. So thank you very much for my speaking slot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hugo. And now you can hear that brilliant round of applause ringing in your ears whilst everybody sits on mute.
You guys can hear that too, huh?
Around the world. So with regards to just, I guess, building on what you were saying right at the end there, which was around how are you going to provide assurance that that what is going through the LME market truly is responsible. So you mentioned auditors, but how else are you going to pull together the data sets required to provide you with that peace of mind that actually something is good enough to be sold through your marketplace?
Yes, it's a very good question. So obviously we already do this for all of our brands to make sure they're good enough from a chemical composition point of view. So we're going to be following a similar format for the ethical requirements as well. Every single brand that produces LME listed brands will be required to do the OECD 5 steps. And this means they all have to assess their risk, their supply chain, assess whether or not they operate in a CARA, so a country in high risk area. And if they do, they have to go down at what we call track A, which means they have to comply with an external standard and then they have to comply with the auditing requirements of that external standard. And if they don't operate in a high-risk area, let's say I don't want to draw on examples too much, but let's say they're operating in a very safe area in northern Canada with really high due diligence principles, then they still be required to go through the 5 steps, but they can choose our track B or track C, which means they go to our website, they complete our red flag assessment templates, and they get audited for that in various ways. But I won't take up too much time, but I can come on to that if you need more info.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Hugo, because I think that there are an awful lot of initiatives or different organisations that are looking at this, almost this silver bullet, as it were, to how do you determine if something is responsible or not. So really exciting to see that you guys are also looking at this. Just building on that, so a question has come in from one of the other speakers that we had earlier on today, Andy, and he's asking, do you foresee a positive, in brackets, price differential for responsible metals going forwards?
Well, I mean, I have to be careful here because we have a policy where I can never talk too much about pricing, but for us, it's not the idea of having a premium for responsibly sourced metal in terms of human rights and conflict minerals. Let's leave aside the environmental side for a second. We're just focusing on the conflict minerals and human rights side. But this is going to be a minimum requirement, meaning we won't actually accept as part of the LME price any brand that hasn't proved to us this ethical due diligencing. So actually, the LME price now will reflect ethical due diligence. So there won't be a difference in price within our contracts because the bare minimum to even be an LME listed brand will be to have completed this due diligencing.
Great, thank you for that. Building on that, and this is a question that came in from Aldo whilst you were speaking, and he asks, so therefore, does LME deliverable mean certification for branded metals?
Yeah, so when you look on Bloomberg and you see the LME price going forward, from once we implement the responsible sourcing requirements, you can be sure that every single metal that makes up that LME price has undergone the ethical due diligencing required to meet our standard. And I can go into more detail about what the ins and outs about and how we're going to monitor this, but you'll know for sure that they at least have met our requirements for ethical responsible sourcing. So there won't be a metal that hasn't undergone this due diligence.
Okay, and I guess this then addresses, so Katrina or Catriona, apologies for how you pronounce your name, has also asked, so how could this information be taken and given to the end consumer? i.e. we only make phones from LME metals, fair trade metals type thing. Is that something that you'll foresee?
So officially, we encourage every end consumer to do their own due diligencing. I think it's still very important for everyone to do that, no matter what. In fact, I think it's encouraged by the OECD and various different governments. But again, the consumers who can see that their metal is within our LME brands list and it's publicly available on our website, the metal they're sourcing will know that at least it's past our responsible sourcing requirements. But again, we always encourage people to also do their own analysis as well.
And I think as well, building on that, so thank you very much, Hugo. I promise we're coming to the end of me pummeling you with questions.
No problem, please.
So this question is in from Victor, and he's asking, so reporting standards are one of those key contributions to build up trusts for the investors as well as customers as well. And so there are a myriad of other reporting standards that are looking to be updated right now. So for example, PERC, which is the European Resources and Reserves Governance Standard. So how much rock is in the ground and what can you actually extract? It's in the process of being updated at the moment. And for example, they are looking for incorporation of guidance on the social license to operate and responsible exploitation, etc. Is any of this useful to what you guys are doing at the moment? Or do you already have your guidelines and your metrics, for example, set?
So we've tried to build on as many standards as possible that can prove to us that they've been OECD aligned by an independent assessor. So that's where we try to use the good work already in the marketplace. But I do have to kind of add the caveat here that we're trying not to bog down our producers with too many requirements, especially as a lot of them are already doing really good work in this space. And the producers, frankly, are the lifeblood of the LME. That connection to the physical world is what makes the LME price so useful and why people like our price so much. So we don't want to overburden them with everything, and as you've already said, lots and lots of different requirements and lots of different standards. We want to use the ones that are relevant for us, and therefore we don't require them to go through too much hard work in terms of this standard and this standard and this standard. I hope that's been clear.
Yeah, no, 100%. And speaking as someone who often receives these lists of questions that you're getting from different customers or investors or different types of regulators, you get hit with the same questions time and time again, some of which are often not really the right question to be asking. So I guess final question from me to you, and I promise this is it. Out of all of the different metals, etc., that you sell in the marketplace, do you foresee there being a difficult child? So is there one that is more difficult than the others, or you can flip that round and say, is there an easy one where you think, yeah, it's mostly responsible?
We want to make sure every single one of our metals that are physically delivered meet that standard, regardless of if they're in Norway or the DRC. But as everyone knows, or that cobalt does have a higher risk profile simply by the nature of where it's sourced. So that is one where we're predicting many of our brands who are cobalt brands will probably be going down our track A, our highest due diligence route. So I think I can be fairly confident in saying that.
Brilliant. So all of you cobalt producers on the board, yes, is yet another set of questions that we asked. Sorry, Hugo, do you want to address?
Well, obviously not all cobalt brands, but again, it shouldn't be seen as if I can just get 30 more seconds, it shouldn't be seen as a bad thing to operate in high risk areas. By the nature of our business, you have to operate in areas that require extra due diligence, and you can do this effectively and safely, and without exploiting people. We do believe that. So even if you operate in the Kara, it shouldn't penalize you as long as you are doing the right thing when operating there, and we believe that many of our producers are doing that.
Brilliant. No, and that's a very, very good note to finish on. Thank you very much, Hugo. And yet again, you can hear that roaring applause from all those people.
Yeah, thank you. It was nice to wear a button-down shirt again.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hugo.
Cheers,
Great.
thank you.
Okie doke. So, ladies and gentlemen, congratulations for those of you who are still sitting in your chairs. I suggest that if you haven't already done so, you make sure that you stand up and run around or wave your arms around and do a bit of stretching. Not because our final session of today is going to be boring in the slightest, is it, Mr. Andrew? But because this is your last 20 minutes of today. And so what I'm going to do is invite Andrew. I can see that you've managed to take yourself off mute, which is absolutely brilliant, Andrew. We're going to welcome to the spotlight position Mr. Andrew Fake. Andrew is the man behind many of the world's largest and most influential conferences with regards to raw materials. And we are very proud to say that this is the first time, I think, Andrew, that you've actually been invited to speak as a speaker.
Yes.
Is true.
Yeah, I think it is. Can you hear me clearly,
Yes,
Sarah?
we can indeed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for an absolutely marvelous event. I thought I'd just start just talking for a few minutes as to a little bit about ourselves and as to why ESG and sustainability has become much more important to us over the past 6 years. Since I've been at Minds and Money, and then throw it open to questions from yourself, Sarah, and also from the audience. I joined speaking events that run the Minds and Money brand back in 2014. And if I'm being really honest with you, is at that stage is issues such as ESG, or it was then called social license to operate, and sustainability issues didn't come up that importantly in the agendas that we put together. And I think that was probably for a couple of reasons. I think that probably outside the 30 top sort of like largest majors and mid-tiers, it didn't come up as an important topic when we were researching it. And it also probably didn't sort of like come up too much in the mind of the institutional investors that form a backbone of our audiences. I think as one sort of very famous sort of major once sort of said to me is that probably back in 2014, you know, social license to operate and sustainability was probably slide sort of like 26 out of 26 in its sort of like corporate presentation slide deck. But what I'm really pleased to say is that that's now changed over the 5 or 6 years since I've been at Minds and Money. I think first of all is the topic of ESG has become much more important in the mind of majors and mid-tiers. I also think that now that institutional investors are certainly grasping this topic much more as well, and they're pushing the topic of ESG much more onto the agendas of majors and mid-tiers, but also more importantly of that, also of the producers as well, and also now into the exploration space. And I think that with that, at sort of like Minds and Money, is ESG has grown in importance as a topic area. So whilst we used to probably just have it just covered on the last day of the event, it's now for us very much a plenary session topic that we'd have covered off on the morning of the first day. I'm really, really pleased to say that it's kind of changed over the last sort of like 5 or 6 years. And I think that what I'm now sort of seeing now is, as well as it being an important issue amongst institutional investors and amongst producing miners, I'm now starting to see junior exploration companies also starting to understand ESG and why it's important as well, and why it shouldn't just be seen as a cost, it should be seen as a value add. And then I think the last thing I'll say before I throw it open to questions, I now hope that what we'll increasingly see as well, we'll increasingly see that retail investors will also realize its importance as well.
So I guess then, just to summarize what you've just said there then, Andrew, so we've seen a big shift over the last few years where the environment, social governance world, so we can call it ESG, we can call it sustainability, once upon a time it was corporate social responsibility, whatever terminology we want to put on it. And I see Ludovine kind of nodding her head saying, yes, Sarah, you could carry on with the terminology. I guess this has changed quite a lot over recent years, and expanding not just in those major companies, but also all the way out to the mid-tier and the explorers who operate in this mining space. Now, with that, Andrew, do you have a flavour of what it is that they're actually talking about? I mean, are they all talking about the same thing, or have you seen themes come and go with regards to what people are actually discussing at these conferences?
I think that with regards to ESG, I think one of the sort of big things that's happened now from the last sort of like 12 months or so is now really, rather than just talking about ESG, starting to have really actionable ESG goals. And I think that the investors don't just want to see ESG as being a tick box exercise that the mining companies do. And I think also likewise, mining companies also appreciate that as well. So it's kind of moving beyond being a tick box exercise, being something that they sort of like really see like value from doing from the ground level upwards. So I'd say that's been probably like the major change that I've seen over the last 12 months. Along with the other thing that I mentioned earlier on as well, is that you're now starting to see exploration companies starting to appreciate the value of ESG. I think I've made this remark, offline to you, is that, sometimes when I used to talk to exploration companies about what is ESG, the most common answer was to ask me what ESG stood for, let alone having like a view on it. I think that they now are sort of beginning to appreciate that sort of like value of ESG, which is why I think that work such as Tara's valuation resources work is really interesting. I think it's sort of like sort of a really interesting way forward for the industry.
So thank you very much for that, Andrew. I'm just going to actually bring in John Thompson now. So John, do you want to come off mute, seeing as you have the power to do so? Because John was asking a question with regards to the representatives of different stakeholders who are at these events. John, do you want to pose your question direct to Andrew?
Sure, Andrew, that's a great summary, thanks. And I've watched your conferences and seen that shift over the years. Do you see, are you already incorporating different perspectives in the conferences, so the non-industry, non-technical perspectives, non-financial perspectives of communities, community representatives, and social scientists? Or do you think that's the next phase, the next change, that you'll start to see a broader, more diverse set of people involved in your meetings?
Yes, so I think, thank you very much for that question, John. Yes, so I think we are trying to diversify in terms of who we go and bring into the event. Previously it had been maybe miners, investors, banks and brokers, etc. But we realized in order to take the conversation to the next level, we need to bring in those groups that we hadn't previously involved, whether it is the NGOs, the non-for-profit organizations, the academia. One thing that we've also done with the event for this year as well is we're actually rebranding the event from Mines and Money and calling it London Mining Week. One of the problems with like Mines and Money is what it kind of does, what it says on the tin, is to use it's to kind of like draw a parallel with a well-known UK sort of TV comedy series. It was a bit sort of like Oh Boy, like Mines and Money kind of like maybe been the right title to have in sort of 2003 when we first like launched the event. It's just not the right title to have in 2020, especially as we want to have the event now covering more issues such as ESG and sustainability, covering issues such as responsible sourcing and mineral supply chain. So hopefully doing that replanning as well helps us bring in those sort of like bring in those groups that previously felt that the event didn't go and speak to them.
Yeah, that's excellent. And just to follow a quick follow on, great to bring those people in. Can you get the audience to listen to them?
I would hope so, because I think that it goes back to my earlier point that, again, back in sort of like 2014, these issues that we are discussing today were very, very low in terms of priority in the minds of both investors and also like miners. So I remember getting criticized by Tom Butler, who was then at IFC. He used to say, Andrew, the problem with your events, you always have these issues shoved at the afternoon of the like last day. He was very, very fair, and you sort of like criticism. Now you find that these issues will be discussed not only on the sort of like morning of sort of like day one, which is our big plenary session, but throughout the entire event. So I like to think that that will and I like to think that that will sort of like bring people in to go and listen to these other sort of like groups. So yes, I think is the answer to your question, John.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, John. I mean, I think it's incredibly astute, because actually what you have is your finger on the pulse of what the investors, for example, are actually interested in. And there's no better way of seeing if people are interested than if they obviously pay with their money or pay with their feet and their ears, so that they can come and actually listen to what you're saying. So with that as well, I mean, in terms of this, communication space and people sharing ideas. So at the event that was held towards the end of 2019, so both Pierre and Ludovine, for example, hosted round tables within the conference itself. Do you see, that different levels of communication actually allow people to get under the skin of different topics? Do you see some types of session being more successful than others?
Yes, so I think that we try to have sort of different learning formats. So, great thing about the big plenary sessions is they obviously bring everyone into the room, and I think that that's where you spoke, Sarah, where we also had Adam Matthews of the Church of England Pension Fund keynoting as well. I think it's also important to have these breakout sessions, whether they are these sort of Chatham House round tables, where often you can go and get these topic areas and have a more of a deep down discussion. So I really like to have sort of like a mixture of the two. It's kind of great to have those like plenary sessions with the likes of Sakala, with the likes of the Church of England Pension Fund. I also think there's a real value add in having these round tables where you can just have like a concentrated group of say 10 to 15 people discussing a really specific issue that they may want to have an hour or a 90-minute talk about, which you probably can't go and cover off in a plenary sort of session, or you can only cover off a plenary session in kind of very, very light sort of detail. So we're certainly looking to do more of that at London Mining Week this year. I think probably the last thing to add to what I've just said is, obviously with London Mining Week at the moment, it's the 1st to 3rd of December, and we are very hopeful that the majority of the event will be physical. But we are very mindful that the number of our attendees will only be able to attend online in the same way that the attendees here today are only attending online as well. So we also need to have online format for them to go and engage as well.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. And another question just here, which I think is to build on what you've just been saying, and this comes actually in from two of the attendees that we've got online at the moment, and that is, how do you think the conference can maybe be more accessible to Joe Public, as Katrina has put it, or consumers who maybe don't necessarily usually come along to these sorts of events? Is that something that you think is necessary with regards to the event? Do you think it's wanted, or do you think it would enhance or destroy some of the conversations that are had within the event?
I think definitely in terms of, we are more keen to bring in members of Joe Public. By that you mean retail investors into the event. That's something that we're always working on doing. And we always have a policy that qualified investors, whether they're institutional or whether they're retail, come to the event free of charge. In terms of, if I sort of like Joe Public, you also mean academia as well. We're trying to work with academia in terms of bringing along not just academia, but also students along to the event as well. So we had the event both last year and this year, we had a Future Leaders Summit where we had in students from the University from Camborne, from Imperial College, and also Dundee University as well. We had about 50 or so students coming up on into the event free of charge as well. So we are trying to become more accessible and broaden our audience. So I think kind of can do both, because especially if you have sort of different meeting rooms and different chat rooms and different round tables, you can still have sort of plenary sessions where everyone congregates, whoever you are. but also have these separate sessions where people can kind of network and have more and kind of have more like tailored learning sessions.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, because I think you need those different levels of discussion, etc., so that people can truly engage and get what they need out of the event itself. So final questions, sir, if I may. And obviously with regards to London Mining Week, okay, the recent rebrand to take it away from the Mines and Money into London Mining Week. There's been quite a lot of chatter today, both on chat and also within the questions, around should we be rebranding mining as a whole? So as a sector, should we go for a rebrand? And if so, what should we brand to? What do you think?
Oh my word, that is a great question. I think my kind of first comment is that just on the rebranding of Mines and Money to London Mining Week, we actually decided it back in February before COVID-19 happened. And I think we decided it mainly just due to feedback we got from the 2019 event, saying that how the event could go and evolve. And it was people like Julian Traeger at Anglo Pacific, people like George Keevely at Investec Asset Management, and also lots of our delegates, lots of our miners, lots of our sponsors were giving us a very, very consistent message that they felt that the key themes for this Mines and Money at that particular time should be communication, sustainability, and relevance. And with that, the sort of like brand change. And they all kept on highlighting that, you know, the problem with mining is it really does have a communication image problem. And it's very strange that for all the good that mining does, you know, I think taking the Mark Cutifani from Anglo-American quote, that mining is responsible either directly or indirectly for 45% of the world GDP, the mining industry has such a terrible image. And I think that what a lot of those people were saying to us is that really is that, you know, although we, you know, we're only a conference organizer, what can we do to sort of like help the mining industry reposition itself and help rebrand itself and help get across the positive news stories that the mining industry does. Now, rebranding ourselves from Mines and Money to London Mining Week may be like a small step in the right direction, and we're only like a small part of the solution. I do believe that that sort of like rebranding, it does kind of hopefully send out the right message to not just the attendees, but I think it's like, you know, the wider public in general, that we kind of recognize that we need to change, and I think we also recognize that the industry needs to change as well. So I think that I'm kind of like hoping that that message will actually get out to the wider media and the wider Joe public when we start to promote this year's event.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew, and apologies for throwing that question at you so late on a Monday evening as it is here in the UK. So brilliant. Thank you very, very much. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that draws today's session, so one and only session, to a conclusion. For those of you who haven't done it yet, if you click on gallery view, you'll be able to see most of the speakers have stayed online. And I'm sure they will all give you a big wave just now. See, look at that. Aren't they beautiful? Isn't this wonderful? So thank you so much, everybody who stayed online for the duration of today. Tomorrow, we have another 2 sessions lined up for you, starting at 8 a.m. UK time and running through till 11 a.m. And it's in that session that we'll get some of our friends from the likes of Australia dialing in, because of course at this current moment in time, they should all be fast asleep. So all of you Canadians, don't worry, you don't need to dial in tomorrow morning. You can catch up on some of those recordings later. So we have our session from 8 until 11, and then we have our second Tuesday session running from 3 p.m. through till 6 p.m, exactly the same as we did today. As with today, we will be recording everything and also attempting to answer as many of your questions as possible. Apologies to those of you whose questions we haven't managed to include either in our live answers or in our written answers as we've been going through this. We shall endeavour to get to you during the week. But also as well, to everybody who has shared all of their thoughts and their insights today, a massive, massive thank you from Rose and myself and everybody else who's been organising this online conference. You guys have done a phenomenal job. We only got in contact with you, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. So thank you so much for pulling together your thoughts so quickly and sharing them with all of us. I think what we're doing here is creating an online repository that will be there for people to delve into, hopefully for a long time to come. And exactly as Andrew was saying with his closing words there, actually, what is it that we're actually trying to do with raw materials at the moment? A huge proportion of the world's GDP relies on taking all of these lovely minerals and metals out of the ground and converting them into something that human beings want to make use of. And so how do we do this in a responsible way? It is not something where we can just stop mining. That's not feasible for us as a human race, but what we can do is do it in a more responsible fashion, many aspects of which we have talked about today. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 2 minutes past 6 here in the UK. I shall let you all wave at one another and head off for lovely suppers or lovely rests of your days, depending on where you are, and hopefully see some of you back again tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye.